Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is portfolio questions on health and wellbeing. Question number 1, Hanzala Malik.
Thank you and good afternoon, Presiding Officer. I'd like to ask the Scottish Government when the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing last met the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and what was discussed.
Cabinet Secretary Alec Neil.
Presiding Officer, Ministers and Government officials regularly meet with NHS boards, including NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, to discuss matters of importance to local people.
Thank you. Hanzala Malik.
Thank you very much for that kind response. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the shocking survey results carried out by the Royal College of Nurses Scotland, which revealed patients were being cared for in cupboards, offices and dining areas last year due to lack of space. Can he guarantee this is not happening now and will not happen anywhere in Glasgow or Scotland in the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, obviously we take any such complaints very seriously and we immediately take action in Glasgow and throughout the health service in Scotland to make sure that where something has gone wrong that shouldn't have happened, that it doesn't happen again. And we've certainly done that in this case.
Many thanks. Question number 2, Liz Smith.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to ensure that all families with children up to 2 years old have regular access to a health visitor.
Minister Michael Matheson.
Presiding Officer, following the birth and for the first 5 years of a child's life, all families receive universal services and contact from health visitors and or the health visiting team. Contacts include child health reviews completed by health visitors or GPs and home visits by health visitors and or a member of their team. Services include a number of home visits in the first year of a child's life and a full family assessment and child development review at 27-30 months of age, which is done by the health visitor.
Many thanks. Liz Smith.
Minister, at yesterday's Education Committee and also today at the Finance Committee, the Royal College of Nursing put on record that they believe that the Young Children People's Bill is a wonderful opportunity to expand health visiting. They claim that they need somewhere in the region of 450 new health visitors. Does the Government agree with that, and what costs will that incur?
Minister.
Well, I suspect that most members would recognise that the Children and Young People's Bill does provide us with a very good opportunity to make sure that we expand the range of ways in which we help to support and develop children and young people in Scotland. We have some work which we are taking forward at the present time in order to review the existing arrangements for health visitors and the numbers of health visitors we have, including our public health nurses in general, to see how we can use them much more effectively. I've got no doubt that health visitors have a very important part to play, and since 2007 there has been a 13% increase in the number of health visitors in Scotland. But in order to make sure that we continue to develop the range of services that our children and young people require, we continue to see health visiting as being a key part of that, and that's why we are presently reviewing the numbers that we presently have to see how we have to take that forward in future years.
Jayne Baxter.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If we are to see an increase in the numbers of health visitors, we must make sure they are being targeted at the communities which need them most. Could the Minister say something about what mapping is being done to see where health visitors are and the services they provide? Minister.
Well, we're already aware of the services that health visitors provide by the very nature of their job. However, there is a patchiness to the way in which different boards actually operate their health visiting teams, and some of the work that we are taking forward with boards just now is to provide them with guidance around how they should take forward their home visiting programme, so we can try and get a greater consistency of approach across the country, and that's work which has been taken forward over the next couple of months with the guidance which we're providing them with. Alongside that, the Children, Young People's and Families Nursing Advisory Group is reviewing Scotland's health visiting capacity overall to see how we have to develop it in the future in order to make sure we build on the progress that's been made since 2007, which has saw a 13% increase in the number of health visitors in Scotland.
Malcolm Chisholm, briefly, please.
Well, I heard the answer that the Minister gave to Liz Smith, but can you tell us what precise assessment the Government has made of how many extra health visitors are made for two of their policies, namely having a health visitor as a named person for all young children, and secondly, the admirable policy of having checks for all children at 2.5 years?
Minister.
Well, we've already set out the programme for the checks at 27 to 30 months, which has been done within existing capacity of health visiting. But as I mentioned in my previous answer, the Children, Young People's and Families Nursing Advisory Group is reviewing Scotland's capacity for health visiting to see where we have to add to that in the years to come in order to meet any growing demand that may be required.
Question number 3, Ken Macintosh.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the effectiveness of the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing's letter of 22nd of February 2013 to NHS boards, encouraging them to support a culture of openness amongst staff.
Cabinet Secretary Alec Neil.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government continues to encourage and promote a culture of openness where NHS staff are actively encouraged and supported to raise any concerns about practices in NHS Scotland. My letter of 22nd February reaffirmed the Scottish Government's position on this matter. We continue to work closely with employers and staff side to ensure that staff are engaged and involved in any decisions which may affect them. This includes influencing all partnership policies which underpin the staff governance standard. This ensures that all staff are empowered and involved in shaping Scotland's NHS in a culture which is open and fair.
Ken Macintosh.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary told us about his letter in response to a question from my colleague Jackie Bailey about the use of compromise agreements within the NHS in Scotland. Clearly, it has not had the desired effect, as my research has found that in the last year, the NHS in Scotland has spent £3.5 million on those secret agreements, and that's more than the previous 5 years of spending on compromise agreements in the NHS combined. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how he intends to follow up on this letter, as it's clearly not creating the transparency that we wish to see?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the member should do a bit more research, because there's clearly a difference between what are gagging orders in such documents and the other aspects that may remain confidential. Very often, for very good reasons, it is agreed and actually requested by people leaving the health service, for example, that certain aspects of their departure should remain confidential to them. It might be to do with pension arrangements, it might be to do with a whole host of matters. The important point is that these are not a cloak for gagging orders. And the last year, or indeed under my predecessor, we put an end to gagging orders which were rife during the previous administration.
Supplementary, Neil Finlay.
Members across the chamber will know that many staff are very concerned and very frightened at their work with increasing pressure upon them every day. Cases of bullying and harassment are a very serious issue. Previously, the Cabinet Secretary has told us that the whistleblowers helpline would be printed on NHS payslips. When will this happen?
Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, it's already happened.
Thank you. Question number 4, Anne McTaggart.
To ask the Scottish Government.
Order. Anne McTaggart.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it will ensure that people who care for stroke patients are given a carers assessment.
Minister Michael Matheson.
We recognise the importance of carers assessments to ensure local authorities and carers provide joint access to carers' needs and services. Local authorities have a legal duty to notify carers who provide a substantial amount of care on a regular basis that they may be eligible for a carer's assessment. An assessment must also be carried out at the request of the carer. The Scottish Government will also be publishing practice guidance later this year on carrying out assessments. This will be widely available to local authorities and to health boards.
Anne McTaggart.
I thank the Minister for that response. Recent studies have recognised that depression and a range of other mental health conditions are often consequences of the illness for both stroke survivors and their carers. In light of this, can the Minister inform the Chamber of the progress that has been made in assisting the thousands of primary carers who are both suffering and supporting others with significant psychological distress?
Minister.
Well, there's a whole range of measures have been taken forward to help to support carers in Scotland with our Young Carer Strategy and with our Carer Strategy, which were published in 2010 and run to 2015. We've also provided a range of different funding streams in order to help to support greater information for carers. For example, we've provided some £13 million through the Carers Information Strategy, which has been delivered by NHS boards. For example, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde in the member's own region have received over £1 million from that particular fund this financial year to help to provide further information. Over the course of 2010 to 2015, we'll be investing some £70 million in other areas of supporting carers as well. But that aside, we've also been working with a whole range of stakeholders to make sure that we look at providing a range of different short breaks for carers. But many of these things can only be delivered in part by government. Local authorities have a key role in also meeting the needs of carers, as do our health boards. And it's important that local authorities also recognise that they have an important role to play in identifying carers and then giving them an assessment to deliver the services that they require. And I would call on local authorities right across Scotland, including the one in Glasgow, to make sure that they are providing carers assessments to local residents.
Fiona McLeod.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I bring to the Minister's attention, following his remarks about the importance to local authorities, of just how many of my constituents come to me as carers, never having been told that they're entitled to a carers assessment, never mind having had a carers assessment done, and that's under the Labour-controlled East Bartonshire Council. Minister.
Well, be aware, I've already set out the legal responsibility on local authorities to provide carers assessments. I think everyone would recognise that we owe a great deal to the many thousands of carers in Scotland who provide support and assistance to their loved ones on a daily basis, and we have a responsibility to do as much as we can to help to support them in that very challenging and difficult role at times. That includes government. We are taking forward a range of measures to do so, and our health boards are also taking forward measures. A number of our local authorities are very proactive in helping to support carers, and I would encourage all local authorities to look at that good practice and to look at how they can then take that forward into their own areas in order to do the right thing in supporting carers in Scotland.
Question number 5, Kenneth Gibson.
To ask the Scottish Government to what extent personal circumstances are taken into account when considering middle-aged men for a free health check.
Minister Michael Matheson.
The Scottish Government recognises the importance of raising awareness of health issues amongst men and is committed to providing the best possible advice and support through NHS Scotland. Through the Keep Well programme, men and women aged 40 to 64 living in the most deprived areas of Scotland are offered a free health check. The health checks are primarily focused on heart disease and its main risk factors such as blood pressure, cholesterol, smoking and diabetes. The checks can last approximately 40 minutes, and wider lifestyle issues such as employability and benefit support may also be explored with the individual. Some 180,000 Keep Well health checks have been delivered across Scotland so far.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the Minister for his answer. I first raised this matter with the Ayrshire and Nairn Health Board on 31st of May, receiving an answer on the 4th of September, which completely missed the point. A constituent of mine called the free health check number. He was asked his postcode, only to be told he didn't qualify. He wasn't asked if he smoked, had a history of heart disease, was overweight, in employment, anything. How can we deliver preventative health measures to difficult-to-reach males when the sole criteria is a person's address?
Minister.
Well, I recognise the concerns that the member has raised. It's worth emphasising that the Keep Well health check is targeted at those who live in our most deprived communities, who are at greatest risk of cardiovascular disease because of a variety of lifestyle factors that I've outlined that could contribute towards this. However, there are a range of services which are available within NHS Scotland for patients who may require assistance or support in actually addressing any other lifestyle issues. And I would expect in these instances where the patient may not come from one of the geographical areas which has been targeted through the Keep Well programme, that their GP would consider what measures might be appropriate and to signpost them on to the right support services that may be appropriate for that particular individual if there are issues that have to be addressed.
Question number 6, Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how much the NHS pays each year in PFI service charges.
Cabinet Secretary Alec Neil.
Presiding Officer, in the year 2012-13, the NHS in Scotland paid £215.1 million in unitary charges under Private Finance Initiative, public-private partnership contracts. Of this, £86.6 million related to service charges and £128.5 million related to financing costs.
Richard Lyle.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? Does the Cabinet Secretary share my concern over these figures and recognise that the money spent servicing these disastrous contracts agreed under a previous government would have been better spent on continuing to improve standards of patient care across the NHS in Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I totally agree with the member. This is another legacy of 13 wasted years under the previous Labour administration. We've even had the Tories abandon PFI as a way of funding these kind of projects. And indeed in Lanarkshire, in the member's own area that he represents, Hare Myers is probably the worst example of a complete rip-off of the public purse by PFI contractors, probably not just in Scotland, but in the whole of the United Kingdom.
Briefly, Jim Eady.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the sale of Balfour Beatty Workplace to GDF Suez Energy Services at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh must not have an adverse effect on patients and staff? And will he join with me in seeking assurances from NHS Lothian that the employment and terms and conditions of the staff at the hospital who deliver such vital services will be protected?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely, Presiding Officer. I'm seeking such assurances, and I also seek the assurance that this contractor will not in any way hold the public purse or the NHS Lothian to ransom in terms of how it handles this particular issue.
Thank you. Question number 7, Rhoda Grant.
To ask the Scottish Government when it will publish its response to the review of NHS pharmaceutical care of patients in the community in Scotland.
Alex Neil.
Presiding Officer, I will be announcing imminently the publication of the Scottish Government's Vision and Action Plan for NHS pharmaceutical care for the next 10 years. I will send a copy to the member as soon as it is published. The Vision and Action Plan builds on the direction of travel of a progressive and developing policy landscape for high-quality, sustainable health and social care, and the comprehensive study on NHS pharmaceutical care of patients in the community undertaken by Dr Hamish Wilson and Professor Nick Barber last year. The Vision and Action Plan will be placed on the Scottish Government website.
Rhoda Grant.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. He knows that the report found that opening pharmacies can have a detrimental impact on GP services in remote and rural areas. Will he therefore put in place a moratorium on granting licences for new pharmacies in these areas until he's had time to consider, respond and take action on the back of the report?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do share the concerns, but under current legislation I'm not allowed to place a moratorium on such issues.
Many thanks. Supplementary, Bruce Crawford.
In regard to the review, as the Cabinet Secretary knows, I've written to him about a couple of pharmacy applications in Drimmen and Killin and about the potential impact on GP services. Does he share my concern around the transparency of the process, the geographical parameters and the funding of GP services in that regard? I've just heard what he said about a moratorium. You might not be able to go that far. You might want to explain that a bit further, Cabinet Secretary. But what else can you do? I think it's time we had an answer on this particular issue.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I share the member's concerns, as I do Rhoda Grant's concerns, and the impact particularly on rural communities, and that's why I've taken the decision to carry out an immediate review of the regulatory framework supporting the pharmacy applications process and the powers given to board in relation to dispensing GP practices.
Broderick Campbell, supplementary.
Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the conclusion on page 9 of the review that services should be accessible and patients should have greater ownership of their own care? And if he does he agree that community pharmacies should not be hindered from opening due to what has been described as the glacial process of the National Appeals Panel?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, I'm also very much aware, particularly in North East Fife, of the issues that have arisen up there, as well as in Uist and in Killin and in Drimmen and other parts of the country. I am very, very sympathetic to the points raised by members representing rural areas, and again, a very good point was made by Roddy MacDonald, and we are taking cognizance of that.
Question number 8, Jenny Mara.
To ask the Scottish Government how many reports of female genital mutilation have been made to the police by NHS staff since 2005.
Mr Michael Matheson.
There have been 3 reports of female genital mutilation made to the police by NHS staff since 2005.
Jenny Mara.
I thank the Minister for his answer. 3 reports seems not very many, as there are 3,000 women in Scotland at risk from having their clitoris cut out. The Minister will know that girls born to mothers who have had their genitals tortured are at very high risk from genital mutilation themselves. Pregnancy screening is a key point for medical staff to identify this risk. Minister, what is being done by NHS Scotland during pregnancy screening to reduce the risk for baby girls?
Minister.
We are aware that there is a risk to approximately 3,000 women in Scotland to female genital mutilation, and some of the work which we are taking forward is part of the work we're doing through the Violence Against Women Youth Strategy, which will be published later this year. We'll have a particular strand to that in order to develop that area of work further, particularly to raise awareness and understanding amongst a range of staff and how we can actually reduce the risk and also to identify areas of risk more effectively. Alongside that, that will help to ensure that those members of staff, particularly within our maternity units, are better informed and in a position where they can actually make referrals on as and when appropriate. As I'm sure the member will also recognise, it's important that where a case is identified, that the individual is provided with the best possible health care, and NHS Scotland will ensure that that happens.
Very briefly, Jayne Baxter.
Can the Minister assure me that the experts tell me that the questions being asked during pregnancy screening are particularly important to identify this risk? Can the Minister assure me that these questions are being asked during the screening? Minister.
Well, an important part of the work we're going to take forward through the new strategy on violence against women is a particular strand on female genital mutilation, and part of that will to make sure that we also have healthcare staff who are properly informed and understand what actions they should take when a case is presented, and in doing so making sure that the woman also receives the appropriate health care at that particular point should there be any requirement for a follow-up.
Thank you, Minister. Question number 9, Drew Smith.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions it has had with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde regarding the filling of vacant positions.
Cabinet Secretary Alex Neil.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is in regular contact with all health boards on this and a number of other matters. The next meeting will be in November when the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde's annual staff projections are reviewed.
Drew Smith.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary very much for that answer. I hope he will be aware of figures released by Unison indicating that vacancies at Greater Glasgow and Clyde are at an all-time high. Unison estimates that the board is short of some 1,800 staff. Will the Cabinet Secretary agree to meet with representatives of Unison to discuss the concerns of frontline health service workers? And will he instruct the board at his meeting in November to fill every vacancy as quickly as possible to avoid further detriment to my constituents whose quality of care is being affected by short staffing?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, one of the reasons why there are more vacancies is because we're recruiting more staff, and particularly into nursing and midwifery and consultant positions, including in accident and emergency. So by definition, when you're increasing the number of people you employ, you do for a period have an increasing number of vacancies. But I have made it absolutely clear to Glasgow and to every other health board, I do not want bank nursing to be a substitute for employing permanent full-time staff in our hospitals. We must make sure that the staffing levels are appropriate at all times, and I have taken measures to make sure that we closely monitor the situation to ensure that the system of banking is not abused in any way whatsoever.
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary, whilst talking about big numbers just now, will know that sometimes very small numbers matter, and if there are particular specialist posts which are vacant and not filled, such as in NHS Lanarkshire, it can create great problems for constituencies and for clients. Is the Cabinet Secretary able to discuss with NHS Lanarkshire how they can move forward out of this quite unacceptable situation?
Well, the question, Cabinet Secretary, was primarily about Greater Glasgow. However, it is about vacant posts, so perhaps you'd like to answer the member.
Presiding Officer, I keep a very close monitor with my officials on the length of time there are vacancies in the National Health Service in each board area, and that's by employment category as well as the more general figures in total. But I do appreciate the points, being a Lanarkshire member myself, about some of the particular issues around NHS Lanarkshire, and we have raised those issues with NHS Lanarkshire to make sure that they fill these vacancies as soon as possible. It has to be said, however, there are some, not just relating to Lanarkshire and Scotland, but indeed UK-wide shortages of particular skills. A very obvious one is a shortage of paediatric skills, for example, which is right across the United Kingdom. So these strategic shortages do present particular challenges. But in general, I absolutely accept the points made by Drew Smith and by Linda Fabiani that we should not delay any longer than necessary the filling of any vacancies in the National Health Service.
Thank you very much. Question number 10, Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it last met NHS Grampian and what issues were discussed.
Cabinet Secretary Alex Neil.
Presiding Officer, Scottish ministers and government officials regularly meet with representatives of all NHS boards, including NHS Grampian, to discuss a wide range of matters of interest to local people.
Maureen Watt.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Following on from Drew Smith and Linda Fabiani, the Cabinet Secretary is aware of the current problems in NHS Grampian with recruiting for certain specialisms and the impact that that has on waiting time. Is there some way that those in training for medical and nursing posts are made more aware of where the vacancies are in certain specialisms and that they can be directed to that? And is it something that can be discussed with the BMA and nursing unions to see if we can get people into the specialisms where there are vacancies?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, Presiding Officer, we're taking these issues very seriously indeed. Indeed, our 2020 workforce vision, one of the areas it's specifically addressing is how we fill vacancies, including strategic shortages. And indeed, Sir David Carter, Chair of the Academic Board, and his committee are looking at this issue as well, to look at the linkage between the throughput of training and the need to fill in the medium term a number of strategic shortages in the country. I should say that NHS Grampian has a particular pressure in terms of rheumatology, and they've recently secured a locum rheumatologist who starts in early November, and he'll be able to contribute to the solution of the waiting times difficulties this service in Grampian has been experiencing, which I know the member is aware of, and a number of members from Grampian have raised with me.
Thank you. Nanette Milne.
Thank you. On a different note, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he'll join me in congratulating those who are about to graduate as the first physician associates in the pilot programme being jointly run by NHS Grampian and the University of Aberdeen? And can I ask how he intends to promote the programme throughout Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I absolutely will join with Nanette Milne in congratulating all the graduates, the first graduates in Scotland to be physician assistants, and I can tell her that from my own experience at NHS Lanarkshire, for example, in a number of areas, physician assistants have already been operating there and are making a very substantial contribution. These have tended to be recruited from the US, where the use of physician assistants is widespread and is seen as a major way in which we can provide enhanced quality and safety of healthcare throughout the system.
Thank you. Question number 11, Joan McAlpine.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisations decision not to recommend the introduction of the new meningitis B vaccine.
Minister Michael Matheson.
As with all new vaccines, we take advice from the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation on the use of this particular vaccine. Meningitis B is a devastating disease, and I'm keen to see we take appropriate steps to tackle it. Nevertheless, it's important that we fully understand how effective any new vaccine will be before we consider introducing it in Scotland. The GCVI is currently consulting further on the use of this vaccine, and I await the final recommendations of the GCVI following the process that they are taking forward at the moment, following which we'll give careful consideration to their advice.
Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Minister for that answer. I have constituents who have lost children to this terrible disease, and they were disappointed with the JCVI's initial decision not to recommend the vaccine. If that decision is not reversed, could Scotland consider acting alone in vaccinating children against meningitis B?
Minister.
I recognise the devastating impact that this condition can have on families, and it's important we look at taking forward a whole range of measures in order to try and prevent that from happening again in the future. As the member may be aware, the Joint Vaccination Committee gave an interim statement in July of this year around their position regarding the new vaccination. They're consulting further on this particular issue at the present time. I understand they are due to consider the matter again at their next meeting on the 2nd of October, following which we would then expect to receive further advice from the JCVI. At that point, we will then consider what further action may be necessary here in Scotland. As the member specifically asked whether we could take action ourselves, the JCVI is there to advise government. However, final decisions would be a matter for the government to take itself, but it's important we make sure that we consider all of the expert opinion and advice on this matter before we come to any final decision on the issue.
Thank you. Question number 12, Michael McMahon.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the effectiveness of the Douglas Street Treatment Suite in Hamilton and whether NHS Lanarkshire plans to introduce similar services elsewhere.
Mr McMahon, could you check for when I call you again? Thank you. Minister.
Presiding Officer, statutory responsibility for service provision rests with NHS boards, in this case NHS Lanarkshire. This is an operational matter for them primarily. The aim of NHS Lanarkshire's review of treatment rooms is to provide a high-quality, standardised and equitable service for all its patients, an aim the Scottish Government obviously would support. NHS Lanarkshire advised that the Douglas Street Treatment Suite has increased the number of available appointments for patients and has enabled district nurses to spend more time caring for vulnerable housebound patients. Feedback received from NHS Lanarkshire from patients apparently has been broadly supportive. However, I am aware of the concerns of a number of Lanarkshire members, and I have asked NHS Lanarkshire to look at the matter to address the concerns of patients and indeed patients' representatives.
Michael McMahon.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response, but the Cabinet Secretary clearly is aware of the concerns of patients and GPs in Hamilton, that the contribution of treatment, the centralisation of treatment at the Douglas Street Centre has created more problems than it has brought benefits for patients. If this model has the support of the Scottish Government, why will the Cabinet Secretary not just admit to the people of Hamilton that that is the case, and tell us if this model also has your support to be rolled out across the rest of Lanarkshire? The Minister intervened to ensure that NHS Lanarkshire reversed its plans on mental health services. So why will he now not intervene and instead claim that he has no power to intervene on these treatment centres?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I've made absolutely clear I'm very well aware of the concerns of patients and their representatives, including GPs. I should remind the member, I'm sure he knows, that NHS Lanarkshire reviewed all treatment room services in 2010, 3 years ago, and proposals have been phased in across Lanarkshire. Hamilton was the last area to be taken forward, and a decision is yet to be taken with regard to the site for the treatment room suite for outer Hamilton practices. But as I have said to the member, I am seeking assurances and any where appropriate action by NHS Lanarkshire to address the specific concerns that patients, GPs and others have had about this particular service.
Very briefly, Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the difficulties associated with access and the level of concern about the relocation of these services to Douglas Street Clinic, local residents have proposed an alternative whereby a shared treatment room service could be established at either the Low Waters or the CADSO GP surgeries to better serve the 10,000 patients in the local area. Would the Cabinet Secretary encourage NHS Lanarkshire to look at this proposal?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as I've made clear, I've asked the NHS Lanarkshire to address the concerns, and obviously if there's an alternative proposal, then they should at least give it some consideration.
Thank you. Question number 13, Malcolm Chisholm.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will extend the inspection of older people programme to include NHS continuing care beds.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, decisions regarding the Older People's Care in Acute Hospitals Inspection Programme are a matter for Healthcare Improvement Scotland. Currently, this programme of work is focusing on acute care. There are 23 acute hospitals across Scotland's 14 territorial NHS boards being subject to inspection against a range of priority areas. To date, there have been 17 inspections across 11 health board areas, including the one the results of which were announced this morning in Forth Valley. The future of inspection and scrutiny within the NHS is under constant review between the Scottish Government and Healthcare Improvement Scotland.
Malcolm Chisholm.
Does the Cabinet Secretary not think there is a glaring gap between the inspection of older people in acute care, which Nicola Sturgeon instituted, and the inspection of older people in care homes, which a previous Health Minister started? Is it not time for the Cabinet Secretary to take action and responsibility for this and ensure that frail older people who spend all their time in NHS continuing care beds also have the benefit of a rigorous inspection regime?
Alec Neil.
Officer, can I first of all say to Malcolm Chisholm, obviously patients throughout the National Health Service in Scotland are subject not just to the particular quality objectives, but in particular to the Patient Safety Programme and the requirements of the Patient Safety Programme, which has been described by Professor Don Berwick as the best in the world. So that includes the kind of people that Malcolm Chisholm is referring to. But I do accept that there is a need to take a strategic approach to the future, given the doubling of the number of older people, particularly aged over 75, over the next 20 years. I don't believe it's such a narrow issue as that identified by Malcolm Chisholm, because with the emphasis of treating people at home, we also need to look at the future quality and safety issues and inspection issues around caring for people in the home. So we are looking at that as a strategic issue. And obviously, I'm happy to meet with the member and discuss his ideas on the matter.
Thank you very much. Question 14, Alex Johnston.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent action it has taken to reduce waiting times at accident and emergency departments.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has introduced a national improvement programme to support improvements in unscheduled care across all NHS Scotland. 5 key themes of activities were identified by an expert group that will lead to improved sustainable performance, getting emergency patients to the care they need, promoting senior decision-making, assuring effective and safe care 24/7, making the community the right place, and improving the primary care response. All NHS boards, including the ambulance service and NHS 24, submitted local unscheduled care action plans in June 2013, describing the whole system approaches and changes they will implement across these 5 key themes. The plans and trajectories for improved performance have been reviewed and evaluated, and further revenue, circa £6.3 million, has been released this month to support early action towards further improvement in winter planning and sustainability.
Alec Johnson.
I thank the Minister for his answer and I wish him luck, but the target of 98% of patients being seen within 4 hours was missed significantly for June this year, with 94.6%. That was down on the figure for June 2012, which was 95.1%. So, before the Minister delivers standard answer number 3 from the SNP bumper book of ministerial excuses, can I also remind him that these figures are worse than those south of the border? Why is his government failing?
Alec Neil.
First of all, they're not worse than the figures south of the border, and the difference between us and the south of the border is our figures are improving, their figures are getting worse, because the priority south of the border is to privatise the health service. That's not a priority north of the border. As the member should know, our interim target is 95%, which we are achieving more or less, and well, we are.
Order.
I think 94.6% is near enough to 95%, and I can assure the member that we are heading towards 98%. And let me say, under previous administrations, this wasn't even measured, except on one occasion, the last year of the Lib Lab Pact in Scotland, when the figure was 86%. So we're doing very well. Thank you.
Question number 15, George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to tackle bowel cancer.
Michael Matheson, Minister.
We know the earlier cancer is diagnosed, the easier it is to treat, and that is why through the £30 million Detect Cancer Early programme, we have introduced a heat target to increase the proportion of Scots diagnosed in the early stages of cancer by 25%, initially focusing on breast, lung and colorectal cancers. To support this programme, we launched the Detect Bowel Cancer Early social marketing campaign in February 2013, highlighting the National Bowel Screening Programme. This activity was backed by an extensive PR, field and partnership activity. In addition, we have introduced a new 2-year primary care initiative to facilitate informed uptake of the National Bowel Screening Programme at GP practice level, and Health Improvement Scotland are undertaking a refresh of the Scottish referral guidelines for suspected cancer.
George Adam. I thank the Minister for his answer. Can the Minister inform me of how many men have benefited from the National Bowel Screening Programme since its inception in 2007? Minister.
In total, there have been so far 1.95 million people in Scotland who have taken up the part of the screening programme since it was introduced in 2007. Of those, 896,724 males have participated in the programme, which has resulted in diagnosing some 1,692 bowel cancers in men. That's a current uptake of almost 52%. It's an important element of the Detect Bowel Cancer Early programme that we continue to make sure that we increase the number of men who participate in the screen programme, because in doing so we can actually diagnose bowel cancer at a much earlier stage.
Thank you. That ends portfolio questions. We're now going to move on to the next item of business, but I'll give a few moments for people to change their seats on the front bench before we do so. So the next item of business is a debate on motion number 7721 in the name of Alex Salmond on Scotland's future. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Alex Salmond to speak to move the motion. First Minister, you have 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, it gives me enormous pleasure to move the motion in my name. In exactly a year's time, the people of Scotland will choose whether to become an independent country. It is a precious thing for any country to be able to decide its own future through a democratic vote following a free debate. That replaces a responsibility on each and every one of us. When this Parliament was reconvened in 1999, Donald Dewar said, in what was my estimation his best ever speech, that devolution was about more than our politics and our laws. It was part about who we are and how we carry ourselves. How we carry ourselves, how we conduct the arguments will be more important than ever over these next 12 months. And both the yes and the no sides must live up to the standards set by the Edinburgh Agreement, an agreement which brings credit to both the UK Government and the Scottish Government. And the debate over the coming year, therefore, must be respectful as well as vigorous, constructive as well as passionate, influenced by empathy, not enmity. And that is the best possible way of ensuring that Scotland next September emerges as a stronger nation. And it means that although both sides will ask searching questions of the other, it is important, incumbent actually, on both sides to set out a positive vision. History tells us that fear-mongering is likely to be counterproductive. Now, it's interesting to look back at some of the rhetoric about devolution in 1997. The week before that referendum, a Conservative leader called William Hague, I wonder what happened to him, he came to Glasgow to predict that devolution would make no difference to schools, hospitals or business. The tartan tax would lead to foreign investors saying no to Scotland. These fears were wrong, 100% wrong. Investors haven't said no to Scotland. Scotland has led the rest of the UK attracting foreign investment. Far from making no difference to schools, to hospitals, business and jobs, devolution has helped us reintroduce free prescriptions, safeguard the National Health Service as a public asset, saving it from the chaotic fragmentation of the health service in England. Under this Parliament, employment is higher, unemployment is lower than the rest of the UK. And the Scottish Government has used its powers to create the most business-friendly local tax environment in these islands. And of course, we're getting similar scare stories at the moment. George Osborne repeated inward investment scare just a year past November. And using the full authority of his office as Chancellor, he said that he knew that even holding a referendum would put off investment. Well, more than a year later, we have had a record year for inward investment and outperforming the UK as a whole. And then there was the even less successful claim over the summer that mobile phone charges would go up in an independent Scotland, a claim published on the very day that the European Commission set about abolishing roaming charges across Europe. And when we hear such stories, it's worth remembering why William Hague and other opponents were so wrong in 1997. They were wrong because they believed that the people of Scotland would make choices that were harmful to Scotland. And the record of this chamber proves exactly the opposite. It's shown that the best people to take decisions on Scotland's future are the people who live and work in Scotland. But at present, in far, far too many areas, decisions affecting Scotland are taken by a Westminster Parliament which has 59 Scottish members out of a total of 650. That democratic deficit affects the public services, employment opportunities and life chances of people across this country. Just last week, the UK Government introduced its plans for Royal Mail privatisations. Privatisation plans that were opposed by 80% of MPs in Scotland. The bedroom tax was opposed by 90% of Scottish MPs, and yet it threatens to penalise 80,000 households in Scotland, 80% of which include people with disabilities. Last week it was condemned by the Special Rapporteur for the United Nations. Now, the Conservative Party chairman said it was disgraceful that the rapporteur was commenting. The disgrace is that she had to comment in 21st century Scotland. In the 1980s, the poll tax became a totemic issue. I'll give way.
Gavin Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Empathy, not enmity, doesn't appear to have lasted terribly long from the First Minister, I have to say. But he suggested that an independent Scotland will not inherit any share of the UK's debts. Does he think that was a smart thing to say, and does it remain Scottish Government policy?
Minister.
Firstly, I don't think that commenting on what the United Nations Rapporteur has said is introducing antipathy into this debate. It's the bedroom tax that's introduced the antipathy into this debate. But, of course, the point I made, and will make again, is if the UK Chancellor insisted on the current position of claiming all of the monetary assets of the United Kingdom, then it follows from the Vienna Convention and every argument that he'd also lay claim to all the liabilities of the United Kingdom. But if, of course, a more reasonable negotiation was to take place, and even if Scotland were to finance our population share of that national debt, as is pointed out in a range of reports, our debt as a percentage of GDP would be less than that of the United Kingdom. That's one of the strengths of Scottish independence. Now, the bedroom tax is a totemic issue now. The poll tax was a totemic issue in the 1990s. It became a symbol of why devolution was necessary. The UK government is implementing the bedroom tax at the same time it's starting to replace the Trident missile system at an estimated lifetime cost of £100,000 million. Now, instead of paying for and hosting Trident while mitigating the effects of the bedroom tax, why don't we as a country remove Trident, abolish the bedroom tax and get on with building a better society for ourselves? Now, Presiding Officer, a crucial point of this debate is nobody now seriously doubts that Scotland could be an independent and successful country economically. Even David Cameron, our leading opponent, put it well. Quote, "Supporters of independence were always able to cite examples of small, independent and thriving economies, such as Finland, Switzerland and Norway. It would be wrong to suggest that Scotland could not be another such successful, independent country." Of course, he omitted to mention that Finland's GDP per head is 5% higher than the UK, Switzerland is now 45% higher, and Norway is more than 70% higher. And for each of the last 32 years, every single one of these last 32 years, Scotland has paid more tax per head of population than the rest of the United Kingdom. Excluding oil, our national income was on a par with the UK. Including oil, our GDP per head is 18% higher in the UK. Why should it be otherwise? We're a country rich in natural resources, with world-class universities, an outstanding visitor industry, expertise in engineering and life sciences, an outstanding cultural heritage, and a skilled and inventive people. Our case is that independence lets us build on these advantages. We have the opportunity to make Scotland fairer, unhindered by a Westminster system that has created one of the largest gaps between rich and poor in the developed world. We gain the ability to create our own welfare policies, which make work pay while respecting the commitment to fairness and solidarity. We gain control over capital borrowing, economic regulation, competition policy, tax policy, energy policy, the very levers we need to make Scotland more competitive and more prosperous. We gain our own voice in the United Nations, in NATO and the European Union. But like 25 out of 28 NATO countries, we won't need to host nuclear weapons. And like 27 out of 28 European Union countries, we don't intend to hold an in-out referendum on membership. We gain the right to decide taxation and welfare, powers that other countries use in a coordinated fashion to strengthen their childcare support. The support we provide for parents and young people could match the very best in Europe. This morning, the Deputy First Minister and I went to a centre run by North Edinburgh Childcare, which provides care and learning for young people from 4 months to 5 years. It's an inspirational example of how quality childcare helps parents, especially women, into work, as well as promoting the well-being of children and families. Under devolution, we've already announced that we will fund 600 hours a year of early learning and childcare for all 3-year-olds and, crucially, fund it properly. But we're doing this in the context of UK policies, the working tax credit, child tax credit, which, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, could see an additional 50,000 children in Scotland living in relative poverty by 2020. It's a perfect illustration of the question this country faces. Why ask Westminster to change course? Why mitigate UK policies when we have the skills, the resources and the opportunity to decide these things for ourselves? Presiding Officer, I talked about the devolution referendum in 1997. At that time, nobody knew for sure what a future Scottish or Westminster Parliament would choose to do. Nobody predicted, in fact, nobody could have even imagined some of the decisions made by successive Westminster governments. We didn't foresee the illegal invasion of Iraq, the fragmentation of England's National Health Service, the harshness of the welfare cuts which would hit the poorest and most vulnerable. And nobody knew, because it hadn't been elected yet, what our devolved Parliament would choose to do. So the 1997 referendum wasn't a vote for the homelessness legislation, the Climate Change Act, or free university or college tuition. It was a statement of confidence in Scotland's ability to make these decisions for ourselves. Independence is about giving ourselves the power to make our country as good as it can be. It's about the right to decide, the ability to make these choices. And this government's argument, our fundamental, our most important contention, is that the people who live and work in Scotland are the people most likely to make the right choices for Scotland. It's not an argument that's subject to statistical manipulation. It's not an argument for a day's headlines. It's not an argument that's born in fear. It's a common-sense position based on our experience. We've been on a constitutional journey in Scotland for more than a century. It's taken many forms as progressively we've moved forward together as a country. Twice before, the matter has been put to a referendum, and twice the people have voted in favour, once narrowly and then decisively. The essence of that assent from the people has been based on the people of Scotland expressing their confidence in the ability of this ancient nation to take decisions for ourselves. That's why independence is the best route, not just to becoming a more prosperous country, but to becoming a more just society. And that is why, exactly a year from today, the people of Scotland will claim that opportunity with both hands.
I now call Joanne Lamont to speak to and move amendment number 7721.1. Ms Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I say I'm proud to rise to speak and to move the amendment in my name. It's because I'm a proud Scot, not despite it, that I support Scotland remaining strong in the United Kingdom. My head tells me it's right, but my heart cries out too for cooperation and not division. And over the next period, we can argue about individual figures and so on. But I want to make a number of points, I think, about the substance that underpins this debate. Because I want to reflect a number of the false premises underpinning the nationalist position, and then speak about what my vision is for the people of Scotland and for the people across the United Kingdom. A vision of a politics which is rooted in the real world, not entirely detached from it. The nationalists tell us, and this is their central argument, that by definition, decisions made about Scotland in Scotland will always be better. But that is an argument that points not only to Scotland leaving the United Kingdom, but to leaving Europe, the United Nations, NATO too. If only Scotland can decide, then no power to make decisions can rest anywhere else but in Scotland. And that is a self-evident nonsense. Alec Neil told us last week that our constitutional argument was like that of South Africa and India. But our relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom is not a colonial one and not to be characterised in those terms. We are fact we are different, that our concerns and priorities are different from the rest of the United Kingdom, when we know that families across the United Kingdom are worried about jobs, their children's education, their elderly parents' care, and about how to make the world a safer place. There is more that binds us together than will ever divide us.
Minister. But earlier today, and I have the quote here, Joanne Lamont herself made the argument for Scottish decision-making. What you said about the Scottish Parliament is what it did teach us, that if power is not too far away from you, if you don't have to look in the eye of those who are making decisions that will affect them, they will make decisions that very often damage them. Wouldn't it be better if the people making social security decisions and the bedroom tax had to look in the eye of the Scottish people at the present moment?
I did think I made an excellent point, but obviously the First Minister has ever missed the point. You are saying all decisions have to be made here. We have the right to make a decision where decisions lie. In the logic of your position, if we wouldn't be in Europe, we wouldn't be in the United Nations, and we wouldn't be anywhere else. There is an assumption that the rest of the United Kingdom wants to deny us our rights, our potential, that Scots are more progressive, fairer and more generous, and if only we could rule ourselves, all the ills of society would disappear. But that complacency, that belief that there are inevitable differences, denies the need every day to reaffirm the importance of fairness and justice, respect and compassion, and insults all those radical voices right across the United Kingdom who are as concerned as we are about what is happening in the country today. Only the SNP could look at the record of a Labour government in creating the NHS, developing the welfare state, opening up educational and economic opportunity, tackling child poverty and supporting people into work, and say there is no difference between Labour and Tory, and then says they offer a promise of a better world funded on the cut of corporation tax 3 pence lower than anything a Tory Chancellor would offer. For the truth is this: regardless of the economic circumstances, on high days and holidays, in good times and bad, the SNP hold on to their belief in independence. It's not a response to the banking crisis, not a response to foreign wars, not a response to a Tory government. It is the politics of nationalism looking for a justification, for a belief held when all else changes, regardless of what the evidence says. I changed my mind in the 80s when I saw what Thatcher was doing to children I taught. But I know that Alex Salmond has been on no constitutional journey. He believed in independence 40 years ago, and he believes in it today. The SNP say they speak for Scottish values, but the values of community, of cooperation, of being a good neighbour, of solidarity are embodied in the United Kingdom, not repudiated by it. The SNP often tell us to look at our history, but too often they are guilty of rewriting it. For it is an understanding of our history that makes me a socialist and not a nationalist. Alex Salmond looks at the Parliament of 1707. He looks at the Parliament of 1707 and says this Parliament is reconvened. This Parliament with a democratic suffrage has nothing to do with that of 1707, and anyone who sees that understands that. It was not the common identity of crofter and landowner that drove land reform, but the struggle of land leaguers like my great-uncle who demanded they had the right to have control over the land that they worked. It was not the common Scottish identity of trade unionist and factory owner which challenged exploitation and danger in the workplace, but the coming together of working people across the United Kingdom in the labour and trade union movement to demand protection and rights in the workplace. It was not the common identity of Scottish men and Scottish women which has seen women's lives transformed in the last century, in the home, in the workplace and in education. My daughter's future, her opportunities were shaped by a women's movement that demanded the way things were should change, and a Labour movement that delivered in legislation equal rights for women. I know there are progressive people. I know there are progressive people in the SNP ranks, but the reality is this: the great changes in our history, the steps in progress in the lives of women, of people with disabilities, of people who suffer discrimination and disadvantage, in the huge issues of the environment and justice, these changes were won despite nationalism, not because of it. Driven driven by a trade union movement determined to make the world a better place, driven by an environmental movement which determined that we would not destroy our planet, driven by the women's movement, the suffrage movement, people through generations coming together in common interest to make a difference. You win change not by changing the constitutional arrangements of your country, but by winning the argument and proving that we can create a better society. The constitutional debate is not about which policies we're going to propose in the general election and the Scottish elections, and ought not to be presented in those terms. The constitutional debate is a once-in-a-lifetime decision to see what our relationship should be with the rest of the United Kingdom. But there is a prize in 2014 when this debate is settled, and in my view, Scotland confirms its place in the United Kingdom. It will end the political equivalent of a get-out-of-jail-free card, where Scotland, unique in the world, does not have to address demographic change in times of economic hardship, when ministers always have someone else to blame. We can start then, as Alec Bell, who I think you all know, reflects, dealing with the real challenges of life in modern Scotland. We can see an end to the tired and tedious, the old tunes. We can have a government which says in public what it thinks in private. We can get a government which respects local democracy rather than cutting its funding and then denouncing councillors who have to live with the consequence of that cut in funding. The hard questions: how do we make our public services sustainable and meet needs rather than be simply a slogan? How do we keep our older people safe, our youngsters educated, our economy strong, when people do not trust politics, and when the debate on how taxation can be fairly levied to create a strong society can barely even begin? That is the tough politics. That is the argument, not infantilising an electorate into choosing between electoral bribes, that it is possible to have everything without it costing anything. We can get back to the rigour of government, which looks at the evidence, understands the problem and then makes change happen. Not what we have got now, not a government but a campaign while Scotland is on pause. Civil servant brains not applied to the challenge of climate change and an ageing population, but applied to an imagined world post-2014. Not asking the hard questions on health, on education, on a care service when a girl of 17 with 4 days training is expected to go out on her own to look after 20 different groups of people. A government that says it cares about homelessness and no longer even counts the number of people who are rough sleeping in our streets across Scotland. We have had, since 2011, an obsession with the referendum. More historic days than you could shake a stick at. The cynicism of promising everyone everything that they want. Let's make the case proudly. Stand up for the state in the United Kingdom. Refresh the opportunity to defeat nationalism and do the real job of politics. Make and win the political case for the real change we need to make our society safer, stronger, fairer. Not the tired and tedious, not the old songs, but honesty, openness and coming together to deal with the real experience of Scots across this country. Use the talents of all of Scotland to make sure that Scotland is a better place. Not nationalism, but a coming together of the people of Scotland in the United Kingdom to make sure that Scotland is, not just claims to be, a better and fairer place.
I now call on Ruth Davidson. Ms Davidson, you have 6 minutes.
Presiding officer, on the run-up to today, the year-out point from the referendum, words like historic, generational, once-in-a-lifetime have been regularly sprinkled in newspapers and on television and in interviews. And rightly so, because this is an era of big politics in Scotland. We are all blessed to be participants in the discussion surrounding our nation's future, and all those eligible to vote next September cast their ballots not just for themselves, but for future generations. We should be proud to be making a mature and democratic choice about the future form that we want our country to take, where we want to stand in the world, and crucially, who we want to stand alongside. I have said before, and I repeat, I neither doubt the sincerity nor the legitimacy of people on the nationalist side of the argument who want Scotland to break away from the rest of the UK and go it alone. I do not share that aim, but I do not question the motives of those who do. And that's why I get angry, Presiding Officer. I get angry on behalf of my fellow countrymen who want to continue to be part of a union that we have built and shaped and contributed to for centuries. And we are told that that belief, that continued contribution, that wish to build something up rather than break away, makes us somehow less Scottish, less patriotic. It means that we're doing our country down, because it does not. I believe that Scotland's future is best served by a strong Scottish Parliament in a strong UK. I believe that the currency union espoused by the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister is a poor facsimile of the economic, financial and political union that we already enjoy. I believe that we are stronger together as part of the United Kingdom Armed Forces, that Scots around the world, proud to serve with a Union flag on the arm of their uniform, are part of the most professional fighting force on the planet, that our integrated land, sea and air platforms allow us to respond to conflicts and crises in all parts of the globe. In 1 second, and I believe that the defence of our allies, our response in the world and the safety of security of our people here at home are best served there. I give way to the Honourable
Margaret MacDonald. I wonder if she's aware of the fact that there are fewer men under arms in the British Army and services now than there were at the start of the Battle of Waterloo. And if I can quote a recent story about Syria, it's a small story, reported that the American 5th Fleet had been moved into the Persian Gulf, while the 6th Fleet had been moved up to the Eastern Mediterranean, whilst he announced that the British has a submarine somewhere in Cyprus. Are we joking about this Great Britain defence?
Ruth Davidson.
I believe the imprint of our footprint around the world. We are in the top 3 defence forces in the world. Our commitment of GDP, to how we fund it. I believe that the future alliances that we have, the future assistance, the future security is best served by a British Army, by a Royal Navy, by a Royal Air Force, not on the division of personnel, on platforms, of assets and on hardware.
The member's not giving way, Mr Stewart.
I believe if the member is making the point that she sees the size of the footprint that we have is less than it once was in different times of war, that breaking up our nation and breaking up that defence footprint is not the point that she is trying to make. The First Minister has talked here about the ingenuity of our people, and I believe in it too. I believe in ensuring the greatest opportunity and prosperity for people in the future, because we have helped to build a UK economy that's not just capable of withstanding shocks which have holed other European nations, but capable of long-term growth. We have prospered through our partnership with the other home nations, and we continue to do so. Scottish businesses benefit from being part of a single UK market. We export twice as much to England as we do to any other part of the world, £45.5 billion annually. Over the last decade, the value to Scotland of trade with the rest of the UK has increased by more than 60%. The First Minister likes to convey a sense that under independence, everything would change, but nothing would change. If we were to leave the United Kingdom, it would inevitably mean different rules on different sides of the border, different financial regulations, different employment laws, different insurance requirements, different tax authorities, different accreditations and qualifications which small companies would be obliged to contend. These are all barriers to trade. They're all obstructions to economic growth. They are impediments to job creation in Scotland that we all want to see. In financial services, nearly 400,000 products, 1/5 Scottish jobs, nearly £10 billion of financial service exports are built on doing business within the single UK market. Our manufacturers are part of a 60 million person market. Our exporters use our embassy and consular network as a platform for trade. And our individual workers who have saved for a future and retirement where they see stability and security, they see it as part of the UK. Presiding Officer, I expect this. I expect to be shouted down by the other side when asking questions about what independence would mean. I expect to be flannelled when asking questions the First Minister doesn't want to answer. I expect a change of subject when asking for evidence to support the latest assertion, because that's politics. But what I don't expect, Presiding Officer, is the same treatment to be meted out to experts and trade organisations who aren't backing one side or the other, but are genuinely looking for the answers that their members need to make an informed decision about what is a historic choice, what is a generational opportunity, what is a world-shaping vote. ICAS, the CBI, the Law Society of Scotland, they've all been told, don't worry, it'll all be in the white paper. People in Scotland need more information on the proposition that is being put to them. That's why the Scottish Government has set a very high bar for the forthcoming white paper. All these questions, many others from groups and individuals across the country, have all been disregarded and set aside and told it'll all be there. Pensions, welfare, currency, international memberships and treaties, taxation, immigration, defence, all of these, we're told, will be in this white paper. I truly hope so, because we have a year to go. We want a future where our countrymen and women have the best chance, the greatest opportunity for future prosperity, for jobs, for exports, for defence, for a secure and stable economy, for autonomy here on areas such as health, education and police. I believe in devolution. I believe in a strong Scottish Parliament, in a strong UK, and that is why I am proud to back the amendment to this motion.
We now move to the open debate. Speeches are 6 minutes long. Can I ask members to try to be as brief as they can? George Adam, followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We do indeed live in exciting times, a time of potential responsibility and of opportunity for our nation. But to listen to the leader of the Labour Party, you would think otherwise. Miss Lamont states that Scotland's on pause. I would say to Miss Lamont that Scotland that she wants is actually a Scotland that would be in permanent rewind, actually offering no ideas, and I'm still waiting for the vision that she offered in her speech. Presiding Officer, this is one of the biggest opportunities our nation has ever had. With independence, we can talk about what we can do instead of talk about what we can't do. The people in this chamber can get together and to discuss what is best for Scotland and Scotland's people. Instead of blaming others, we will take on the responsibility of government. I met the Cabinet Secretary for Education at breakfast this morning, and he quoted me Wordsworth because he was so excited about today. I, of course, knew exactly where the quote was from and instantly Googled it. But afterwards, I decided to think about some other things as well, because when the public are listening to our debate, they want to engage with this debate. They want to actually engage and find out what independence offers and what the union offers. I believe the union doesn't offer us the future that independence does, but I've yet to see the case or the vision for retaining the union. So I decided that it might be a good idea, if we're talking about the tale of two nations, the tale of two governments, then we might take the first lines from the tale of two cities, which is effectively, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, but we had nothing before us. Now that's exactly what the campaign seems to be like as far as the public are concerned at the moment. We offer the positive vision for Scotland and an independent nation. The No campaign just come up with absolute negativity, constantly offering nothing, just saying some of the same and just offering the people of Scotland nothing. And we have to be better than that. We are better than that. I believe that everyone in this chamber actually became involved in politics. We may not agree in party policy and issues, but we all got involved to make a difference in our own communities. Myself, it was from my own community in Paisley, and for the people in that area, because to me, people, the two P's, people and Paisley, are the most important things for me. So I have to say that one of the things with the negativity that comes out is that I had some school children in from the grammar yesterday. There are people who will be voting in the election because of the policy that we have now before us. And what they actually had, one of the teachers asked about independence, and he says it's the most important question. So I think these new voters should know. So me and the individual who was there for one of the No campaign parties actually had the debate. And the children ended up, the young people, sorry, because they'll be voting, they actually laughed at this member because he told them, you wouldn't get BBC iPlayer. Scotland can't run its own national broadcaster. The other ones they actually mentioned was the fact that in culture, one boy who'd had a bit part in Waterloo Road wouldn't be able to be an actor because Scotland wouldn't be able to sustain anything like that. Even the students of Paisley Grammar laughed at that no campaigner because they could see it. One young boy came up to me, short boy. No, I will not because he's not here. But one of the young boys came up to me afterwards and in that Paisley tradition said, George, he says, you had him in toast. During that same debate, the same individual actually mentioned that George has been fighting for this for 40 years. Now, I mentioned, the line was mentioned by Miss Lamont as well with regards to the First Minister. You know, I was 4-year-old 40 years ago, so I have been involved in the campaign for quite a while, but even I will admit that I wasn't involved then. So surely we can talk about things more positive. I never tired about talking about the positive case for independence and for our country. That's why I got involved 28 years ago when I was 16. And I was motivated for what was best for my local community during the dim, dark days of Thatcherism. Yes, no problem.
Must be brief, Ms MacDonald.
It's just in the matter of 40 years. I was there, and we had the report, one child in 10 born to fail.
George Adam.
I remember at the time as well, and it was one of the things that actually motivated me to become involved in politics, and it's one of the reasons why, in the real world, why the policies of this Scottish Government and the Scottish National Party work with the Scottish people, because they believe in the same things too, but I believe we can all work together. You know, the Westminster, time moves forward, but Westminster doesn't. Westminster would remain static. But if you look at some of the things that the Scottish Government has done with the minimum powers of independence, you know, we've maintained the council tax freeze, higher education fee-free, post-16 reform bills offering an access to university for people from all backgrounds, children and young people's bills offering 600 hours in childcare, and that's a start because obviously when we get full levers of independence, we can move things forward. So when you look at that and you look at the positive results that we could have with independence, you have to ask yourself, why aren't we in charge of our welfare? Why are we not in charge of welfare? Why does the No campaign constantly be negative about all the situations?
You must bring your remarks to a close, Mr Adam.
We have the bedroom tax. We have the bedroom tax currently, and also we've got Mr Sarwar, who is Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, who is constantly making all kinds of accusations and policy on the hop on TV stations. But he says, why don't we look at the non-political Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who have already said that the powers to address child poverty already exist in the Scottish Parliament. He said that it was not what the Rowntree Commission actually believed. So
I really must ask you, Jayne, Mr
I look
Adam.
forward to the day, Presiding Officer, where we can sit here in this Parliament and have a proper debate about Scotland's future.
Neil Findlay, followed by Linda Fabiani.
Presiding Officer, I was going to make an appeal for the debate to reach a new level, but I'm afraid with that speech, it already has.
Order.
Presiding Officer, I don't and never will question anyone's commitment to their country or their community, and I hope that no one ever will question mine. Opposing independence is not anti-Scottish, it's not unpatriotic, and it's not an act of treachery. And it's my deeply held view that the SNP's version of independence is fundamentally flawed and absolutely not in the interests of working people in Scotland or beyond our borders too. As Alec Bell, the First Minister's former adviser, says, today's problems are common to all countries in the developed world. And that is very true. Because currently in Scotland, poverty and inequality are at appalling levels. If you're born into a poor household and community, you're likely to become ill and die sooner than a more affluent Scot who may live in the next street or the next community. There's an 11-year... That's not because of the union. That's what you need to get into your skull. It's not because of the union. It's because of the system we operate under. Presiding Officer.
Order.
Presiding Officer, in order to give me my full allocation, can I make a point of order?
It's unusual for a point of order during the speech, but please go ahead.
It may be unusual. It may be unusual, but I would like to do it.
I'm sorry.
When this debate
Mr.
started...
Findlay, 1 minute, Mr. Findlay. Mr. Findlay wants to make a point of order. I'd like to hear his point of order.
Thank you. When this debate started, the First Minister was heard with courtesy. Since then, opposition members who have spoken have not. I wonder if we could maintain that throughout this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Findlay. I always suggest that members in this chamber always treat each other with courtesy and respect, and I think everybody in the chamber would do well to remember that. Mr. Findlay.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. There is an 11-year gap in the life expectancy between men in the most deprived communities and the most prosperous. That is a scandal that will not change simply by erecting a new border. Well, for families who, in this day and age, can't feed their wains and have to attend food banks to survive. Yes, that's due to Tory welfare cuts, but there are also things that this Parliament can do to help with current powers, but the government choose not to. Last month, no sit down. Last month we saw 10,000 more.
Excuse me, Mr. Findlay, could you resume your seat? We've just had an exchange about courtesy and respect. I expect courtesy and respect from every member, and that includes you.
Thank you. Last month we saw 10,000 more Scots join the dole queue. 48,000 fewer young people are attending our colleges, and poverty pay and zero-hour contracts are the desperate norm for so many of our young people. These are not issues that will be tackled with drawing a new line on a map or swapping one flag for another.
Jamie Hepburn.
It may not be a case of a new flag or drawing a new line on the map that will allow this Parliament to deal with these matters, but might investing the requisite powers in this place and taking away from the hand of the Tories not allow us to do it much better?
Neil Findlay.
I will come to that, Mr Hepburn. And they will certainly not be tackled by replacing UK and EU neoliberalism with a more parochial and further entrenched Scottish version as promoted by the First Minister and his party, because that is what's been proposed in the SNP's version of independence. The Finance Secretary regularly reminds us he wants Scotland to be the most competitive place in Europe. But let me tell you what, in this context, the word competitive means. It's a euphemism for low pay, poor conditions, and the ripping out of cash from our public service. Hundreds of millions of pounds ripped out of schools, roads and hospitals and gifted to corporations in a tax cut. Presiding Officer, how on earth will that address the inequality and lack of balance in the economy mentioned in the First Minister's motion? It is nonsense. The fact is it will do the opposite. I know Mr Swinney, Mr Ewan and Mr Russell, they support trickle-down economics, but it now appears that that famous young radical, who we all remember being thrown out of the House of Commons for protesting against Nigel Lawson's corporation tax cut, now champions a cut that even Osborne dare not make. Presiding Officer, I would like to see us learn from past mistakes. Last week, 25 senior academics, trade union leaders, politicians and activists launched the Red Paper in Scotland 2014. It's in the Parliament bookshop, First Minister. I would recommend it to you. Go and get a copy and help educate yourself. This book promotes a positive agenda for political change in Scotland, an agenda that argues for major political and democratic reform, to free up and re-empower local government, to work in the interests of citizens, not the diktat of central government, an economy that's more democratic with forms of social, cooperative and public ownership, so that we can balance societal, environmental and economic considerations for the well-being of the entire society. The renewables industry, a prime example of where it can be achieved. Look for an industrial policy where government support and intervention creates jobs and sustains them, and sustains investment. The Forth Bridge contract, the greatest missed opportunity we've had. And we need a taxation system that supports and services communities and not financial institutions and transnational companies. A housing policy linked, not at the moment.
You must bring your remarks to a close, Mr Findlay.
A housing policy linked to an industrial and employment strategy that drives social justice, and a public procurement policy where people are only given contracts when they pay a living wage, pay their taxes and don't blacklist workers. These are steps that we could take, many of them here and now, but as well as in the future. And I believe that that would be best achieved through enhanced devolution. A race to the bottom in taxes, wages and public services is in no one's interest, least of all working people who in the end will suffer most if the big business agenda promoted by the SNP comes to fruition.
I now call on Linda Fabiani to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was looking forward to this debate in Scotland's future because it's very, very welcome on this day 1 year before our referendum. And I find it so exciting because it's a referendum that means following that we'll have the opportunity to shape our nation's future to help Scotland achieve its potential. And I just think that's such a privilege. So why is Scotland not achieving its potential? Scotland is blessed with an ample supply of good quality land. We have oil and gas reserves worth an estimated £1.5 trillion. Our potential for renewable energy is second to none. We produce renowned food and drinks. We have an educated population, a skilled workforce and a diaspora with a foothold in every corner of the globe. However, our population is stuck at 5 million, which is a relative loss equivalent to the population of Glasgow at its peak. And after 40 years, not a penny of oil revenue has been invested for the long term. By contrast, our neighbours have an oil fund of about £100,000 a head. As Neil Findlay confirmed, successive UK administrations have made the UK one of the most unbalanced and unequal countries in the developed world. The richest 10% control more than 40% of the wealth. The richest 20% have average incomes 14 times those of the poorest 20%. And while Scotland's population stagnates, London and the South booms. Scotland's GDP per head, yes, of course.
Smith.
Grateful to the member, Presiding Officer. I wonder if she could tell me of a redistributive policy of the current Scottish Government or of the SNP after independence.
Linda Fabiani.
I think, Presiding Officer, Mr Smith has just proved the point that the Labour Party here have no idea what this debate is actually about. It's about your country's future. I think you should rise to the challenge of talking about it. Scotland's GDP per head, excluding oil, is the third highest for any part of the UK, yet we have a deprivation that shames our country. And all the measures tell the same story, and that is that the Union is not working for Scotland. While Scottish Labour helped privatise England's NHS, we argued for a Scottish welfare system. When Alistair Darling signed off high-speed rail to just north of Watford, we wanted Scotland to control its own resources. And while Gordon Brown funded the Iraq war, we campaigned against nuclear weapons on the Clyde. As the contrast with Norway shows, another future is possible. We can change Scotland for the better if we have the courage. Now, I was struck just over the last few days by the contrast between these statements. Number one, it is by being confident in ourselves, in our communities and in our values that we can remain an open, liberal nation. Followed by, I'm not quite sure there are unique Scottish values. The first was Clegg on the UK and the second was Rennie on Scotland. Dare Scotland be confident in itself, in its communities and in its values? Not if Better Together has anything to do with it. Labour calls us a something-for-nothing society. The Lib Dems deny us our values. And they pretend to offer us a positive vision for Scotland's future. In asset-rich Scotland, 1 in 5 children lives in poverty. There is no prospect of this Parliament getting the powers it needs to tackle child poverty within the UK. How can we tell? George Adam was right. Anna Sarwar said so on Monday, live on the BBC. According to Scottish Labour's leadership, if we have child poverty in Scotland, it must be the fault of this Parliament and not of the Tories. How bizarre. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the powers to tackle child poverty reside with Westminster. We say independence. Yes, of course.
I'm sure the member read the JRF report with interest, and she will be aware that the JRF explicitly said that the debate on independence should not put off a debate about the powers of the Scottish Government, which could be used to tackle child poverty, and indicated that they'd failed to do so.
Linda Fabiani.
The Joseph Rowntree Foundation said quite clearly that the powers to tackle child poverty reside with Westminster. I wish Labour would stop creating smokescreens for their Tory partners and Better Together. Is there a single figure in the Better Together parties which have the courage to even demand additional powers now to let us look at some of that? Let's face it, I've talked about this before many times. Forget the Unionist promises. They will not deliver. They had the chance during the Scotland Bill to bring welfare to Scotland, to get together and go for it. They have no intention of doing so. Willie Rennie spoke about more powers. A Glasgow agreement, I heard him on the radio. As I said, had the chance, didn't take it. Do you know what? There's such a thing as a London agreement, and that's legislation. So put your money where your mouth is, all you people who say there's going to be more powers, and insist that it's in legislation. Because I'll tell you what, the Tories will never go for it, and Labour MPs in the north of England would be off their heads to vote for it. No one knows today what Scotland's future will be 10, 20, 30 years down the line. That's up to us next year, a year from now. Opportunity or status quo and decline. What I do know, though, is that the people best placed to make Scotland thrive are the people who care most about Scotland. That's the people who live and work here. I passionately believe that, as I passionately believe that voting yes in 2014 will give the people of Scotland the power to deliver, and they'll grasp that and they'll deliver.
Malcolm Chisholm, followed by John Mason.
Presiding Officer, Peter Jones in The Scotsman yesterday reminded us, interestingly, of the distinction that Professor Neil McCormack made between existentialist nationalists and instrumentalist nationalists. And I think it's fair to say that all of the members opposite are existentialist nationalists in the sense that they will vote for independence irrespective of the economic arguments for or against Scottish independence, whereas thousands of people out there, possibly a majority, will base their decision on what they think the economy will be like in an independent Scotland. And in that regard, I thought it was very strange that the First Minister today hardly mentioned the economy. I think he made 3 points, which I'll refer to in a moment. Now, on our side, our argument for remaining part of the, not yet, part of the United Kingdom is partly based on social solidarity with the rest of the United Kingdom, partly on believing that strong devolution gives us the best of both worlds, but also crucially on the assessment that we have relative economic advantages in being part of the United Kingdom. Now, today's debate, it seems to me, and today's speech from the First Minister was all about something else, notwithstanding the fact he's an existentialist nationalist, so in a sense to him the other arguments don't matter at all. He was trying to frame the debate in two ways. Firstly, to undermine any critique of independence, particularly the economics of independence in terms of scaremongering, and secondly, trying to frame the debate in terms of Scotland versus the Tories. And that, of course, is why the First Minister is only interested in debating with David Cameron. I'm sure lots of us would like to debate with David Cameron. We'd have quite a lot of easy points to make against him. But he is not interested in debating with Alistair Darling, who is the perfect... In a minute, I need to move on. In a minute. He's not interested in debating with Alistair Darling, who is the perfect person to debate the economics of independence. Now, the three points, in terms of both his knowledge and his experience and what he achieved, as I shall remind members in a moment, which is why I can't take interventions till I've done this. Now, the 3 points that the First Minister did make about the economy, one albeit in response to Gavin Brown. Firstly, and this is what always happens, we get a selective quotation of facts. So we were told that in each of the last 2 or perhaps it was 3 decades, we've paid more tax per head than the rest of you. That's correct, of course, because of oil, which we all welcome, though it won't last forever. But they never say what the spending was. And the fact of the matter is that only for 6 of the last 22 years has Scottish revenues, as a percentage of UK revenues, been higher than Scottish spending as a percentage of UK spending, only in 6 of the last 22 years. Again, this year is quoted because it happens to be higher this year, but only 6 in the last 22 years has it been higher. Secondly, he talked about control of tax policy, but Gavin McCrone, and I recommend everybody reads his book as the standard one on the economy, makes clear that fiscal policy would be overseen by the rest of the UK. And all the economists say that, even John Key and others who are First Minister's advisers. And then thirdly, in response to Gavin Brown's point about not inheriting a share of debt, which is absolutely ludicrous, of course Scotland would inherit a share of debt. And the point is that long-term interest rates for borrowing would be higher, and that is also a very important point. So even with all the weaknesses and problems of the present UK economy, we have advantage of low interest rates, which we would not have in 2016. I'll give way now.
Matt MacDonald.
I'm interested by Mr Chisholm's quoting of our much-missed friend, Dr Neil McCormack.
would he define himself and the Labour Party as existentialist unionists?
Well, I've already said it. I've already said it's a combination of. I've already said the three facts which drive us, so I don't think I really need to repeat those. So I think the economic situation, I've only got 2 minutes, facing us in 2016 is going to be crucial to this debate, and there's lots of other economic points that I wanted to make, but somehow it's taken me 4 minutes to say what I've said already. But even under the current adverse economic circumstances, we have advantages being part of the UK. 4 times as many of our experts go to England than the whole rest of the world put together. We have the advantages of financial services, George, being part of the UK, research funding to our university, twice our population share, and so on. Now, it's about social solidarity, as I've said, but it's also about risk. It's also about pooling risk. I'm not going to have time. Alistair Darling was derided by people, but Alistair Darling did many important things as Chancellor, and one was to rescue the Scottish-based banks. Because back in 2008, if we had been independent, and again I'm referring to Professor Gavin McCrone, who is generally respected by the SNP, he says that our finances would have been overwhelmed, and like Ireland, we would have had to seek bailout from international organisations. The same principle of pooling risk applies to welfare spending. Currently, even excluding health, Scottish welfare spending is £3,972 per head compared to £3,658 per head in England, and our welfare spending is expected to grow more rapidly because of our demography, and the balance of our population will have more older people relative to the working age population. So it's an advantage for pensioners to remain part of the United Kingdom. Now, my last point is Alex Salmond, I'm very glad, went with Nicola Sturgeon to the best childcare centre in Scotland in my constituency in West Pilton this morning. And we've heard in the last few months a little bit from Alex Salmond about childcare. I didn't hear anything from him between 1987 and 2013, while Joanne Lamont was talking about it, and I was as well in my maiden speech in 1992. But I'll pass on that. The point I want to make is twofold. Firstly, many of the advances in childcare came from the UK Labour government. I regret the fact that the current government's cut the childcare tax credit. It was one of Gordon Brown's great achievements that he instituted the childcare tax credit, which helped many parents afford childcare. But secondly, the Scottish government can do far more on childcare now as it can on other policies. So devolution can do a great deal now. More enhanced devolution can do even more, and that is the message that I'll be speaking about in the next 12 months.
John Mason, followed by Travis Scott. Can I please ask members to try and keep the time to 6 minutes? We're very oversubscribed at the moment.
Yes, Presiding Officer. I think we can start off this debate by being extremely positive about Scotland. Lots of good things have happened in Scotland in the past. Lots of good things are happening in Scotland in the present. And even the dour pessimists have to accept that a lot of good things will happen in Scotland in the future. When I moved out of my parents' home in my early 20s, it was not primarily so that I would be better off. In fact, in the short term, I might have been better off staying put and having my bills paid by my father. But it was so I could develop more as a person, have the freedom to make my own choices, live my life the way I wanted to live it. And in fact, some of the choices I have made have been similar to what my parents would have chosen. However, I have no regrets about moving out from home at that time, and I believe that many of the good things that have happened to me in my life since then have been because I've been living in my own. We are asked what exactly Scotland will be like if independent, but of course we do not know exactly what the UK or any other country would be like in the future, independent or not. So of course we cannot spend the whole debate going through the detail of what will and will not happen. We must not spend too much time in this debate getting too bogged down in what the costs and benefits will be in year one. We need to look at the longer term. We need to look at the bigger picture. And things like how would Scotland's attitude be changed by being independent? How would our confidence about starting businesses and lots of other things be changed by independence? How would our standing in the world be changed by independence? Or as Alex Salmond said, how would we carry ourselves with independence? And I believe that we would benefit from independence in the way that a student invests 3 or 4 years of their life in getting a degree. That's a major step. That's a sacrifice to start with, but it's for their benefit in the long run, and they do better in the long run. There's a lot in this motion that we could speak on, and I'd like to focus a little bit on what the UK has been like in recent years, what it's like now, and where it's going to be in the future. And my first point would be to say that the UK is far too small for the future. Once upon a time, there was a British Empire, and we could all trade with each other and ignore the rest of the world. However, nowadays, we have some pretty big countries out there. China, 1.3 billion. India, 1.2 billion. The United States, 300 million. So at 63 million, the UK is at best a medium-sized player. Whatever happens in the future, we must look beyond the UK. Of course, we want good relationships with England, Wales, Northern Ireland, not to mention Ireland, the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man. But these are not big enough for us to grow our export markets and to attract tourists from just these places. We need to be part of something bigger than the UK, and the European Union is the clear answer to this, so that neither Scotland nor the UK stands on their own. But we want to be in partnership with other countries so that we can stand in the world on equal terms. We must move away from the narrow nationalism and parochialism which we see at Westminster and in the British media, and become much more outward-looking and international. So if Britain is not the answer for our future, has Britain been a success up till now? Well, look around us and see. When I've been out round the doors, especially in some of the poorer areas, a lot of people say to me that things are so grim at the moment that it cannot be any worse if Scotland was independent. Well, that is not exactly a totally positive vision, but it does say something for where a lot of people are. And I think that's the answer to Neil Findlay in some of his debate, that the UK has had 300 years to get things right and has failed. How much longer does he want to give the UK? Britain, yes, by all means.
Doesn't he realise that if you simply replace a system of economics like we have operating across the European Union at the moment, and just take it parochially to Scotland, nothing will have changed. In fact, some of the policies that you promote will make it a whole lot worse for the people that you're talking about.
John Mason.
Well, I think it's a bit unfair in the European Union, which I would consider as considerably less liberal than the UK, and I think some of our slightly better employment legislation has come from Europe despite the UK. I also think we can look at the Nordic countries, but my whole argument here is that we need to be more outward-looking. The UK is far too inward-looking, it's too narrow nationalist, it's too parochial, and we want to break away from that and be a much more outward-going country. Britain is one of the most unequal developed countries in the world. Some people have fabulous wealth, other families are struggling even to feed themselves. Now, let's remember, Westminster was handling the economy, Westminster was handling the banks when it all went pear-shaped. So yes, let's focus on the future, but let's also remember the track record of those who got us here. It's all very well having assertions that Britain will do better in future, but is there any actual evidence that this will happen? Will Britain become more equal if we stay there? How exactly will Britain become more equal? I don't see much signs of it. What has the recent history been? This largely unequal society of ours hit problems a number of years ago. We needed to have some at least temporary measures to right the ship. Now, would we do that by taking some money at least from the rich and powerful to make an extra contribution? Or would we squeeze those at the bottom a bit harder? Well, I think most of us here would have agreed it should not be the latter. But of course it was the latter that happened. How would Britain get out of its problems? Cut benefits to the poorest.
Should we draw to a close, please?
Is there any evidence that Britain will do things differently in future, or is that just an assertion? Thank you.
Many thanks. Now Colin Tavish-Scott, to be followed by Eileen MacLeod.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I thought Mr Mason's speech there was deep on irony, but then I realised he was being deadly serious. I was standing in a queue at Heathrow a couple of weeks back, waiting for the Edinburgh plane home, and a businesswoman turned around and said to me, "So Tavish, if the SNP have their own way, will I need a passport to get home?" I don't know the answer to that, and nor does anyone. Will I need a passport, Presiding Officer, to visit my daughter in Leeds or my family in the West Country of England? Who indeed knows? The only certain aspect to a yes vote in September 2014 is uncertainty. The border arrangements between an independent Scotland and England would have to be negotiated. Scotland would have to negotiate with the rest of the UK on how to enter a country that is the biggest market for our goods, where many of us have family and friends, and where so many Scots work. How would that uncertainty be so good for the people of Scotland? If the Nationalists assert that those who ask these questions are scaremongering, they assert that a white paper will answer every question and many that haven't even yet been asked. Most of us doubt that. But the one certainty is uncertainty. Ask the Nationalists if Scotland will keep the Queen as head of state. Mr Salmon says yes. Oh, another said yes there. But Ms Hislop on the television this week said no. There'll be a referendum on the future of the monarchy. What is to be Scotland's currency? Mr Salmon says the pound. The chairman of the Yes campaign, Mr Dennis Canavan, says no. Scotland will have its own currency. Yesterday, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research said the additional cost to an independent Scotland of staying with the pound would be 0.72 to 1.65% above UK borrowing costs. Scots with mortgages, millions of us, want a straight answer on that. And, Presiding Officer, they want a straight answer on their pension, their employment rights and their job too. More uncertainty. So on every area of policy, independence is a walk in the dark. It is opening a door into a pitch-black room and trying to find the door on the other side. We may never come out, but the one certainty is the door marked UK will be locked forever. There is no way back. On that I entirely agree with Mr Salmon. This is irreversible. I do not believe that most Scots will enter that room. For the faults of the present flawed system of democracy we have, the majority, the great majority, will stay with the best of both worlds. Scots want a Scottish Parliament with more powers, doing more things, but within the larger family of the UK. I want to see a federal United Kingdom, one where the decisions affecting Wales, Northern Ireland, England and Scotland are taken in those nations. But we come together and agree the right way forward on international events where the UK's collective strength is immensely more powerful than the individual voice. I don't understand why any Scot would actively seek to lose a place on the United Nations Security Council, nor would want to carry the most votes possible into the European Union's Council of Ministers, or cut the record level of overseas aid to assist in Africa and countries around the world less fortunate than us. And yet that is what the Nationalists want.
A little bit of order and courtesy, please.
I am encouraged by the progressive voices, indeed in Labour, making this case for a federal UK. Not enough, but some still to come. The other entirely negative argument the Nationalist government uses is that they are powerless because this Parliament doesn't have the full economic and legislative powers. I don't, in passing, remember that being said when Glasgow won the right to host next year's Commonwealth Games. But take the environment, a word barely mentioned in the recent budget speech setting out Scottish spending in the years ahead. This Parliament passed world-beating environmental legislation, a consistent claim by ministers, yet that legislation sets carbon reduction targets which have been missed by this government since they were set. The environment is secondary to independence, as is our schools, our hospitals that we depend on, or the buses to work. So this Nationalist government is sadly fixated, not on Scotland's needs, but on their own. I confess that I misjudged Mr Salmon's government. I actually thought the SNP believed in a decentralised state with decision-making involving local people in their own towns, villages and communities. But 6 years of Nationalist government have shown how wrong I was. The most striking change to the government of Scotland under Nationalist rule is centralisation. The levers of power are pulled in Edinburgh, the command and control of the public sector by Nationalist ministers, local government removed of financial powers. Thank goodness local councils are now led by David O'Neill, who will stand up to that. Police centralised into a national force. Policing is now based on Strathclyde writ large. I have no doubt that a more enlightened, decentralised Scottish Government in the future will have to address that wrong policing policy. The Quango state across Scotland is just not worth having. The Nationalist Government should go the whole hog and subsume every Quango into the centre. The pretence today that Visit Scotland or Scottish Enterprise are anything other than wholly owned and directed subsidiaries of the Nationalist Government is gone. The Quango state, unelected, undemocratic and a tool of government ministers, that is the reality of Nationalist government today. So there is one certainty about next year's referendum. The Electoral Commission will be powerless to stop the full use of the government machine being used for entirely political purposes. The Scotland I want is a decentralised country which relishes and enjoys its economic, social and geographical diversity, one where decisions are taken at local level to benefit local people, consumers, businesses, teachers and nurses. That's why when islanders meet in Kirkwall tomorrow, we will be working out what we want, not Edinburgh or London. Our islands, our future is recognising that the best people to decide the future of the islands are those who live and work there. I did not campaign for this Scottish Parliament, nor for Home Rule settlement within the UK, to have one-size-fits-all politics from St Andrew's House. The alternative, a positive alternative, is a federal UK, a stronger, more accountable Scottish Parliament, a Scotland where decisions are taken not by know-it-all ministers in Edinburgh, but by local communities in a vibrant, exciting reawakening of democracy. That is a Scotland I want to be part of, and it is a Scotland we will build after this nation votes decisively for a positive future within our United Kingdom.
Thank you. Now call on Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Cameron Buchanan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am delighted to speak in this important debate this afternoon about the future of our country. In a year from now, people in Scotland will have the opportunity to vote for independence, a vote that will allow our citizens to take control of their own destiny and to build a Scotland that reflects their values, their aspirations and their principles of economic and social justice. That is what independence is about, ensuring this Scottish Parliament has all of the powers that it needs to shape the economic and social future of this country, ensuring that the decisions affecting the people who live and work here are taken in a Parliament elected by and directly accountable to the people in Scotland, safeguarding our citizens from Westminster policies that seem intent on punishing the weak and the most vulnerable in our society, while spending billions of pounds on a nuclear arsenal based on the Clyde, guaranteeing that our young people will have opportunities to build their future here in Scotland by maintaining access to our universities on the principle of ability to learn, not the ability to pay, or making available a training or apprenticeship place for all young people between the ages of 16 and 19 who are not already in education, employment or training. But despite our best efforts, Presiding Officer, in this Parliament, we will not achieve the truly radical transformation in Scotland's economy and society the people in Scotland are calling on this Parliament to deliver, unless we as a Parliament are equipped with the powers we need to do so. And that means giving this Parliament powers over taxation and powers over welfare policy. Powers, I would argue, are essential if we are to be able to address the deep-seated problems that continue to afflict many in our society. Powers to allow us to reverse the welfare reforms introduced by Westminster. Powers that allow us to tackle the glaring inequalities in income and health that continue to divide our society and compromise our shared commitment to social justice. With independence, Presiding Officer, this Parliament will have these and other powers that will allow Scotland's government, of whatever political persuasion, to change for the better the direction of travel of our economy and society. And like other colleagues in this debate, I'd urge people in Scotland to look at what this government and this Parliament has achieved in those policy areas where it has the powers to govern for our people. Consider, for instance, at the wholly different direction of travel of the NHS, north and south of the border, and ask the question, which NHS model do people in Scotland favour? I have no doubt that an overwhelming majority in Scotland support this government's commitment to a model of healthcare that is free at the point of care for everyone and that rejects the creeping privatisation that is changing and, I'd suggest, undermining the face of the NHS and the delivery of healthcare south of the border. In protecting Scotland's NHS, the Scottish Government has demonstrated what can be achieved when this Parliament has the appropriate powers. For example, this Government has remained true to the founding principles of our National Health Service by abolishing prescription charges and removing an unfair tax on ill health, the abolition of which are benefiting people with long-term conditions such as diabetes, asthma and Crohn's disease in particular, introducing free eye tests for all and providing free personal and nursing care for our elderly citizens. But the health of our nation is about much more than the delivery of medical care. It's about enacting legislation that prohibits smoking in public places and changes the difficult and unhealthy relationship that Scotland has with alcohol. And it's about introducing policies that mitigate the level demand on our public services by improving the general level of the health of our citizens, the preventative element of healthcare. These are positive measures that we have and are taking here in this Parliament. Presiding Officer, successive Scottish governments since 1999 have worked to improve the health of our nation and maintain a National Health Service in Scotland that is fit for purpose. They've demonstrated what can be done when the power to act rests with this Parliament. But if we are to do more, if we are to tackle the inequalities in income and opportunity in our country that underlie many of the health problems we suffer as a society, if we are to avoid what I consider will be the very negative healthcare consequences that will result from the welfare policies of this UK government. And if we are to create the jobs that we need to grow our economy and raise the standard and quality of life here in Scotland, if we are to achieve that, and be in no doubt that is what the people in Scotland expect and deserve, then we must have the powers to do so, powers that we presently lack and powers that only independence will give to this Parliament. Scotland does indeed have an abundance of resources and talent and can more than afford to be a successful, thriving, independent country. That is why, Presiding Officer, I'm confident that a year from now, the Scottish people will choose that all of the decisions which affect Scotland are taken by the people who care about Scotland the most, the people who live and work here. I support the motion in the First Minister's name.
Many thanks. I now call on Cameron Buchanan to be followed by Christian Allard. Members will be aware that this is Cameron Buchanan's first speech in our Parliament, and I invite members to respect this. Cameron Buchanan, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The applause that I received at my swearing-in and the silence that came before it, I think it was due to the relief that I actually made it, as opposed to my presence. I believe it was Ronald Reagan who remarked that it has been said that politics is the second oldest profession. I have learnt that it bears a striking resemblance to the first. Well, Presiding Officer, I have now experienced one of these professions and I'm happy to confirm that it's quite enough for me. But on a serious note, to take on the role of an MSP is pretty daunting, as everyone in this chamber will know. The support I've received and the kindness shown by members from all sides of the chamber, and more widely the parliamentary staff, have made this challenge so much easier, and I would like to express and record my sincere thanks to all of them. Of course, I know that we would all wish, myself included, that there hadn't been a vacancy for me to fill, given the terribly sad circumstances in which it came about. There have already been many fine tributes paid to David McCletchie in this chamber, and I hope members will understand if I take a minute also to remember him. I knew him well and considered him a good friend. I could always rely on his encyclopedic knowledge of popular music to whittle away the hours spent on the campaign trail. I'm told by my Scottish Conservative colleagues that there were two reasons that you went to David's office. Either you wanted advice or you were in trouble. Indeed, it was not unheard of to go to see David expecting that you were looking at the former, only to find out that you were to your horror, that you were very much in store for the latter. Well, Presiding Officer, I can honestly say that I would dearly have loved to call in to see my friend for either of these things in the last few weeks. I know how highly regarded he was as a parliamentarian, but I remember him simply as being a good friend in good times and in difficult times, and I don't mind admitting how much I miss that friendship. That said, Presiding Officer, David would expect us to look forward and to get on with the job in hand, and I fully intend to do my very best for the Lothian region, which he represented so well for so long. I'm sure members will understand my sheer pride and sense of privilege at representing Edinburgh and the Lothians in this Parliament. We've just finished another tremendously successful Edinburgh International Festival and Fringe, where our capital is very much on the spotlight. People from across the globe come to enjoy the very best in the performing arts, to soak in the atmosphere of our historic capital, and of course, to marvel at the spectacle of our ongoing tram works, which were originally due for completion in February 2011. Is this, I wonder, what the First Minister meant in his speech by a constitutional journey? One aspect that struck me during the festival and various fringes was the level of coverage and attention it received from the media and members of the public from across the UK. It is clear that interest and excitement over the annual Arts Festival is not confined just to the Lothian region, nor for that matter Scotland. Indeed, it is obviously important for the whole of the United Kingdom. And it is that relationship, Presiding Officer, the link between Edinburgh and the Lothians and with the wider United Kingdom, which is so important to our future success and growth. Scotland is the UK's second biggest financial hub beside London. It accounts for 24% of total jobs in the insurance sector, and Edinburgh boasts the headquarters of Tesco Bank, Virgin Finance, and global headquarters of the RBS Group. All of this goes to show just how important the Scottish services sector is in the UK. And from the perspective of Scotland, 45.5 billion was generated in exports to the rest of the UK. And of this, just under 10 billion came from the financial and insurance activities alone. Scottish products and services are sold in large number throughout the United Kingdom. 84% of mortgages provided by Scottish firms are sold to people living elsewhere in the UK. 67% of the ISAs are sold to people living elsewhere in the UK, and 70% of the pensions sold by Scottish firms are sold elsewhere in the UK. When we set out these terms, we see just how important the UK is to Scotland, and indeed Scotland is to the UK. As a market for our services and goods, how vital it is to continue access to that market and on an equal and competitive footing for our future success. Of course, the rest of the UK is not our only market, and from my experience of the textile industry, I can vouch for the importance of our trade within the EU and Europe. Indeed, earlier this year, it was reported that Spanish MEPs, one Conservative Catalonian and another nationalist Catalonian MEP, were engaged in a bitter war of words over Spain and France's response to Scottish independence. Confirmation, presiding officer, that along with energy, whisky, textiles and our other more established products and services, we're now also exporting our constitutional wrangling to our neighbours in Europe. Who knows what untapped markets we may find for our newest product? The very public disagreement between Ramon Tremosa of the Democratic Convergence of Catalonia Party and Alejo Vidal Quadras of the Spanish People's Party does expose a good deal of unease elsewhere in Europe over the ongoing debate about independence. It is not difficult to see why this unease where it comes from and why it's there, given the fact that the United Kingdom is not the only country where a constitutional debate is going on. There are many examples I could give, but commentators have already noted that close attention Brussels, Madrid and Berlin, amongst others, are paying to the debate and its outcome. That unease and concern is bound to colour their attitude towards the issue of Scottish accession to the EU, which in turn will create uncertainty that will impact on the confidence of Scottish businesses and those looking to invest there. Presiding officer, Scotland's future success and prosperity will be largely determined by our relationships with these nations that surround us. First and foremost, therefore, must be our link to the United Kingdom, which such strong evidence about the benefits of that union brings us. It is surely crucial that we maintain and strengthen that bond rather than break it. Thank you.
Many thanks. And before I call on Christian Allard, and to ensure that everyone has already requested to speak can be taken, I'm minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 8.14.3 to extend this debate for approximately 10 minutes. Minister. Many thanks. And so the question is that this debate be extended by up to 10 minutes. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. I now call on Christian Allard to be followed by Ken Macintosh. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I would like to thank Cameron Buchanan for his first speech in the Chamber and to welcome him in the Chamber. I did welcome him in Parliament a few days ago, and I was very impressed with the way the conversation went, because of course it went in French, in a perfect French. And I was really impressed, and I'm sure it will be a great addition to this Parliament. And what I would like to say is we come from the same background. We come from the export background, and me too. I exported a lot to the rest of the UK before I came to this chamber. And I don't recognise this idea that somehow people are worried about it. I think it's a bit like investments coming into Scotland that had been proved wrong last year with record investment coming into Scotland. I don't think export will be exactly the same thing. I think the level of export will move and increase with independence than decrease. However, first of all, I would like to speak about Professor Sir Neil McCormick when he said the goal of a free Scotland in a favored sense must be taken as prescribing the freedom and equality of all citizens, regardless of creed, class or ethnic origins, and the free participation of them all as equals in the process of self-government. In a word, democracy. This appeals very much to me as someone who was not born here and someone who is privileged and honoured to be in this Parliament, but someone who's been engaged in the political debate for some years. And I don't recognise, for example, what the leader of the Scottish Labour said earlier on when she talked about that she was proud to be a proud Scot, and somehow nationalism was on these benches and not on her own benches. You know, I've got difficulties to... Yes, of course.
Neil Finlay.
Thank you. When he was mentioning the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, I thought he might have said the leader of his party, because I understand he's a supporter of Labour for Independence.
I was just coming into this. But I'll come later if you don't mind. Presiding Officer, what I would like to say is, as somebody coming from a different origin, I think it's very, very important that we recognize that this debate is for the people who live and work here. And this is not the first time. Presiding Officer, I would like to say that in 1997, I did vote for this Parliament to be built and to take place. I did the same thing thereafter in each Scottish elections. Very, very important. Well, we maybe change the tone of this debate. When we talk about proud Scot, when we talk about nationalism, we are talking about the people who live and contribute to this society. We're not talking about ethnicity. We're not talking about which nationality, where people were born or where they come from. It's any accent, any religion, or whatever you are living here in Scotland, you have the right to vote, and we need to respect this. And we've got a project in the future. It's a vote for our children and for our grandchildren and their own children. And it's very important to me, as somebody who's got 3 grown-up daughters, Scottish daughters, of course, they consider themselves Scottish and not French. I think this debate is more than important to help women to understand what kind of future they can have in Scotland. I think we can have a start of this debate and this vote in 2014, having an empowerment of people, and particularly empowerment of women. I think some of the members in the Labour benches talk about, how we could do better for the women in Scotland. And I think the start-up could be in September 2014. That can be recognised in the movement of independence we have seen. I can easily imagine an overwhelming yes vote in 2014. And why can I do that? First of all, you've got movement like Women for Independence, which has been a fantastic movement right from the start of the campaign. And again, who can express themselves and can really show us, presiding officers, what kind of future women can have in society in a new Scotland, in an independent Scotland. There are many, many other groups who have been involved. For example, I created French for Independence, which is important and which is open to anybody speaking French. And I'm sure our new member will be happy to join if he wants at any time, if he wants to change his mind. But there are other groups as well. Farming for Independence, that was launched in the borders, and then we took it to the Torah shows. And the Torah shows, it was so humbling to see so many farmers who came and asked questions and wanted to be part of the debate and wanted to see what kind of future farming could be after a yes vote. The same thing for fishing. I'm going tomorrow morning to the Peterhead Fish Market on Friday morning. And on Friday morning, the Peterhead Fish Market, I'll get the same question that I got in the Tory show. And it's very, very important that we can consider a new Scotland with all these sectors. These sectors are very important for export and very important for our future. And of course, there is the groups of different political parties. Some people kind of think that, a yes vote is only for nationalists. Whatever you want to define nationalist. I don't define myself as nationalist, or maybe I will define myself as French if I wanted to define myself as nationalist. But it's more than this. It's about the people of Scotland from whatever party they are, whoever they vote. There is now a group for Conservative for Independence who would have voted this, even Liberal Democrats, there are some left, who decided to have a group as well. And they are not here? No, they are not here. So it's plenty of a group. And of course, in the left, Mr. Finlay is totally right. In the left, there are a lot
if you draw to a close, please.
There are a lot of people who want independence, and Labour for Independence is very important. So it's what I wanted to say today. I want to say it's a lot more than that only one party, but it's open to everybody who can contribute to who live in this country. Thank you, President.
Merci. I now call on Ken Macintosh to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, President Officer. And let me say from the outset that I agree with the First Minister's motion today that Scotland has an abundance of resources and talent. I also agree with him that there are decisions we can take and gains we can achieve for families and communities. The problem is that instead of taking those decisions, instead of constantly pushing ourselves as a Parliament to utilise these resources and that talent, we are holding ourselves back with relentless debates on our constitutional framework. I find it interesting that when you ask Scots, do you want more powers for the Scottish Parliament, and what powers would those be, the most common answer is health and education, the powers we already have. We should be building Scotland's future through the decisions we take today, not in a year's time. Presiding Officer, I want to tell you a little about a boy in one of my children's classes at school, without identifying him, of course. And one advantage of having 6 children is that I think I've got a good chance that no one will be able to work it out. But I want to give you as full a picture as possible, because his story illuminates a little of the Scotland I want to see in the future. I think it was clear to many of us who knew this boy from an early age that he was in danger of going off the rails. His parents were very young themselves, had their own difficulties to overcome. As a child, he was allowed to run wild. He wasn't nasty at all, but you could see that without help, he was going to end up in serious difficulties. Now, this same boy is now thriving at high school. He's maybe not in all the top sets, but he's doing very well, and he's enjoying life. And why? Mainly because of his head teacher at primary. There will be other factors I know at work in his life, but I also know that his head spotted him. He spotted him as a bright, lively boy, but one who needed to be steered in the right direction. And instead of constantly punishing him or telling him repeatedly how bad he was, he told him how good he was at football and other activities. He probably exaggerated how good he was, in fact. At one stage, the head used the small amount of discretionary budget at his disposal to take the whole school year ice skating, something this boy was quite good at. He created an environment in which this boy could shine. In other words, the head teacher helped build up his confidence, his self-belief, and his resilience. It's difficult for me to do justice to this whole story, but that's why I want Scottish schools, all Scottish schools, to be like. When we talk about Scotland's future, that's why I want all Scottish teachers to have the opportunity to be able to do, yes, to give our children the education they need, to develop the skills and talents that will allow them to flourish, to stretch the able and support the vulnerable, but perhaps, above all, to reach out to individual pupils to help our children become confident, rounded citizens. The worrying truth is, yes, this is happening in some schools, but not in all. As good as our schools are, they are still not doing enough for too many children. Now, some members may have seen a very interesting research paper published this month by the David Hume Institute. It was commissioned, in fact, by the Scottish Government from Professor Lindsay Pattison on the subject of philanthropic investment in education, and it provoked what can only be described as an animated response. The paper itself recognised both, on the one hand, that Scotland is a very charitable nation, but that we are sceptical, if not entirely resistant, to philanthropic interventions in education. I won't go into the paper in any detail other than to suggest it's worth reading. But there are a number of observations from Professor Pattison which struck me, and one in particular was that his report identified, I quote, a sense that Scottish education is felt to be too uniform, a strength but also a constraint on innovation. In other words, we are strong on equity but weak on diversity. And I would ask, can we not have both? I certainly believe there's much we can do right now to maintain the fairness that is at the heart of our education system, while offering a more pluralistic choice to our children. The Schools of Ambition programme a few years back was an excellent initiative. It gave schools access to some limited but direct funding to develop their own identity and ethos. We already have some schools which excel at dance, music and sport, but we could do so much more to encourage others to specialise in maths, science or modern languages. Now, like most parents, I want all my kids to achieve the exam results to reflect their abilities, but I want them to have more. I want them to have greater integration with extracurricular activities. I want schools to build on the network of support that's already there from surrounding clubs, golf, football, drama, whatever's there. I appreciate that not everyone may share my vision for Scotland's schools of the future, but isn't the point that we can agree or disagree about these matters right now? We don't have to wait for a vote next year. Our children's future is in our hands in this Scottish Parliament today, and we need to act now to give them something to aspire to. The motion before us this afternoon talks about tackling inequality, but do young people really have an equal choice when it comes to vocational education? We should be raising standards across the board, not forcing everyone down the same academic path. We could be promoting vocational options as a genuine equal choice, but the policy and budget decisions made by this Scottish Government in this Scottish Parliament have demoted Scotland's colleges. At the very moment we are facing a generation of young people lost to unemployment or underemployment, we are shutting the door on the training and skills they need. Presiding Officer, we are already shaping Scotland's future through the powers of this Parliament in a devolved UK. One of the first acts we took was to transform nursery education. We've rebuilt the school estate. We've restored teachers' pay. We can do the same again for childcare, for those with additional needs, for vocational education. We don't need permission or more powers to do so. But over the last 6 years, it feels like Scotland's been on hold. We have lost 4,000 teachers and more than 1,000 college lecturers. We've seen empty promises on class sizes and student debt. We've seen stalling tactics rather than action on childcare and nursery provision. Presiding Officer, this government is not offering a vision for Scotland's future so much as a mirage. Above all, I want Scotland's children to look to the future with hope and optimism about the life they will lead, the jobs they will hold, the difference they will make. We have the powers to do so under devolution. I support the amendment in the name of my colleague Joanne Lamont.
Many thanks. Now call on Christine Graham to be followed by Margaret MacDonald. 6 minutes, please.
Hope and optimism, Deputy Presiding Officer, reminds me of Alistair Darling this morning in Good Morning Scotland, disowning negative, no campaigning, then breezing on to advance a bleak future for Scotland, all but cut off from our trading partners, cut off from our English relatives, news to me being half English, cut off from the expertise of UK government, and he just stopped short of cutting us off from the rest of the world and from prophesying that plague of locusts. I think I'll nickname Chicken Licken and his unionist pals Turkey Lurkey and Ducky Lucky. And for those unfamiliar with the tale, the ending is a happy one, for despite dire unfounded warnings, the sky did not fall in.
Invite you not to stray into unparliamentary language, please.
I wish you were aware. I'll tell you the story later, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's very wholesome. But let's take the proposition head on, that we are indeed better together. Is that really the case? Firstly, did we in Scotland get the governments we voted for? For 62 of the last 67 years, Scottish MPs as an entity have had no practical influence over the composition of the UK government. The clarion call from Labour over the years has been vote Labour and keep the Tories out, and it doesn't stand the test of time. Today in Scotland, we have 41 Labour MPs, 11 Liberal Democrats, 6 SNP and 1 Tory. But we have Tory policies supported by their pals, the Liberal Democrats. So we have the bedroom tax, cuts to benefits for the most vulnerable, privatisation of the Royal Mail, food banks. But on the plus side, we have Trident. So much for democracy and the protection of Labour. But we all know it's the economy, stupid. So what is the track record of UK governments on our economy? I look back on the voting years I've notched up, and in the early days when I voted Labour, the first time was in the 60s. Harold Ganex quoted pipe-smoking Wilson. For the period in power, when he was in, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Sound familiar? Oh, and there was the wee matter of the devaluation of the pound in 1967 to cope with a domestic economic crisis, and the famous phrase at the time of breaking away from the straitjacket of, wait for it, boom and bust economics. Callaghan didn't do much better. 1978 to 79, the winter of discontent, 30% inflation. The streets of Scotland and the rest of the UK littered with uncollected waste, hundreds of thousands taking to the streets in protest and bodies unburied. And all this while the oil revenues flowed in. Then came Brown and Darling, subprime lending and banking collapse. Darling, the no man, telling us of doom and gloom. Well, he certainly knows doom and gloom when he sees it. He took us right there. Well, what about the partners in the union, the Tories? Surely they can't be as hopeless with our money. Well, yes, they can, Alec Johnson. Remember Black Wednesday, 1992, breaking news then. UK crashes out of ERM. The Tory government suspended Britain's membership of the European exchange rate. Chancellor Norman Lamont spent billions trying to prop up sterling. I think the phrase today is quantitative easing, printing paper money to you and me. To today, and Dahlia Alexander, mustn't forget the Liberal Democrats, I try to, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, pronouncing that austerity, cuts to you and me, will continue until 2020. And of course those cuts are borne by the poor, not the rich. In the meantime, the oil and gas revenues have been producing wealth and revenue to the UK Exchequer for 40 years and have decades to go. But do we have an oil fund like Norway, a small independent country discovering those reserves at the same time, worth today trillions, which sounds a lot to me? Of course not. That Norwegian fund has 1.78% of European stocks. It's said to be the largest stock owner in Europe. And it can be choosy and only authorises ethical investments. They have so much money, they have to think of more ways to invest. Talk about money in the bank for a rainy day. Compare that with the report card of UK governments over decades, which is dismal. Oil and gas revenue squandered, the rich getting richer, the poor poorer, and more of the same. You know, if I was offered a guarantee that I would get the government I voted for, the chance to have my nation's wealth under proper stewardship so it could be used for investment in Scotland's people and a more just society, it wouldn't be a hard choice. Independence for Scotland is just that guarantee. All the rest, the daily diet of negatives from no, is a desperate distraction from that simple truth.
Many thanks. Now call on Margaret MacDonald to be followed by Nigel Donn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As every speech has shown, there are alternatives, so why independence? Because we're worth it. And of course independence will make Scotland better off. Not perhaps by the 500 quid promised by the Scotsman. I think we could get them down to 450, but that's another story. We'll be more entrepreneurial, we'll be bolder, and we'll be doing just as every other country has done that has become independent or has regained its sovereignty in its own right. They've been able to mould their society and their economy in their own image. Communities change, and it may well be that there was an argument at one point for the total community of the United Kingdom having one economy. There isn't now. There's too much of a difference, Presiding Officer, particularly between the southeast of England and the rest of us. So there are very practical arguments. Now, that may make me an instrumentalist nationalist, in the words of Malcolm Chisholm. I hope it doesn't hurt anymore, because I think we have to concentrate on these practical things. Only I won't point out, as Kenneth Macintosh did with a very, very good speech showing that he knows how many beans make five in education. I won't point out that these are all the things we could do if only we just stick with the United Kingdom. We've been stuck to them for a while and we haven't got round to doing them all. And it's not because we don't want to. Maybe it's because the amount of money that we have to move around is in the column, the thin column at the end of the accountant's sheet of paper. We cannot move mountains if we don't have the fundamentalist tools to do that. You can move molehills perhaps, but that's not going to satisfy any of us, I hope. Now, our aspirations, I believe, will rise if we go for independence, because I believe our self-respect and our feeling of pride in ourselves and our boldness, as I've said, I think that will grow bigger, just the same as everybody else's does. Now, other people's opinions of us from outside Scotland will reflect that. It won't make us a world power, but do we want to be a world power? I don't think anybody wants to be, but neither does it hold very much attraction to stick with Britain and therefore fall into the category as described by President Putin's advisor, who described the country formerly known as Great Britain, an unimportant little offshore island that nobody bothers about. Now, that was his assessment of the United Kingdom, and it fair takes the sting out of the argument that we are better defended. Better defended with one submarine when the United States can put the 5th and 6th fleets into the same conflagration in the world. Better defended when we send boys and men out to Iraq and Afghanistan with the wrong boots and with not the proper armoured carriers. I don't think we should boast too much about what we can do in defence now. The defence chiefs are saying we cannot put an army into the field. So what is the argument in favour of being defended by Great Britain, as it was called? Things change. It no longer holds water to chant that we have the best of both worlds. Just what's so good about this British state? My friend and colleague, the existentialist nationalist, Christine Graham. No, you can't. You're an existentialist. Well,
we stick to the subject.
I apologise, Presiding Officer. She's making me laugh. It's not the defence that I'm going to talk about. I have talked about the men without boots and so on, but what about the aircraft carriers without planes? How are we going to defend when we're spending all our money in aircraft carriers with no planes? How about the social wage? Is that the best in Europe? Is that something that we should aspire to? Is that the best we can do with all the millions coming off the North Sea that there is just now? Well, no. The pensions are amongst the worst in Europe. They're not quite the worst, but they are amongst the worst in Europe, and some of them are absolutely shocking in what they produce as a result. I won't go into details here, I don't have the time, but everybody here is aware of how shocking. For example, a huge percentage of our old people find at the end of their life that is left to them if they've got the pensions that we give them and the accommodation that we give them, which brings me on to housing. Now, when I was the director of shelter a long time ago, we said that we're short of houses in Scotland, so if we're going to sell council houses, then they had to be replaced, and that might have worked. The councils had to be able to replace them with the proceeds that they got from selling the council houses. But that was forbidden from London. We wanted to do it in Scotland, but London didn't want to do it, and Labour in London backed the Tories in London, and that was just a fact, and we're living with the results of that today. So it's not a fashionable thing to be a nationalist as far as I'm concerned. It's been going on for a while that I worked out that the best way to look after people in Scotland in as good a way as we possibly could would be to do it for ourselves. So I will be voting in favour of this independence proposition, although there are lots and lots of things that I've still got to argue out, because I hope the government makes it plain that there will be choices of how we accomplish the same objectives in our independent Scotland. Neil Finlay and I might yet march shoulder to shoulder.
Thanks. Now call on Nigel Donne to be followed by Kezia Dugdale. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to get from aircraft not being on aircraft carriers to the short walk, actually, from my house that will take you to a couple of constituents whose house is an old one. It's a cold one. And for reasons that really don't matter, they're not able to work, they're on benefits. There are quite a number of these, and they are in every constituency and region we represent. I'd like to look at why they're cold, because energy poverty is something that we as a Parliament have tried to address, which the government has tried to address. There are 3 elements to it which I'd like to analyse. And you won't be surprised, Presiding Officer, that I should draw the conclusion that if we leave ourselves in the hands of Westminster, we'll be cold for a while. Whether a house is cold or can be decently heated depends on its energy efficiency. It depends on the way it's built. It also depends actually on where it is, and members will have noticed that Scotland is generally rather colder than the rest of the United Kingdom, and actually we do need slightly different policies up here just because the numbers are different. But the energy efficiency is something which the government, this Parliament, can actually address. But we need a bit of help from Westminster. The Green Deal will, I think, eventually turn up. It's certainly slow, and I fear it will be ineffective. But the things that we have no control over are price and income, or very little control over income. If I look at price, first of all, we will notice that is entirely reserved to Westminster. If you happen to be off the gas, and much of Scotland is, then you're paying over the top. And all our tariffs are in fact regressive, with a fixed charge followed by the marginal. If you're in the worst possible position and you have a prepay meter, you actually have the worst possible charging rate. Now, if I then look at income, because if the family income was higher, then you would be better placed to pay for the energy that you want to use. But as the First Minister and his colleagues do not tire of telling us, most of the economic levers are in fact reserved to Westminster. And the other part of this family's income, of course, is welfare benefits. And I'm grateful to the Poverty Alliance, who have told me, and this is published information, there's been no assessment of the impact of welfare reform on fuel poverty. The UK government has stated a review will be carried out in 2015. It's clear that the combined impact of benefit reductions and changes will increase the number of people living on low incomes. However, how this translates to fuel poverty has not even been modelled. Are we in good hands if we're in the hands of Westminster? Well, at the moment, the answer is no. I would have thought that it would be pretty clear on that ground alone that as we live in a fuel-rich country, I don't need to quote the numbers, albeit a cold country, then surely we would be in a much better place if we actually looked after that ourselves. Ken Macintosh's story, I'm grateful to Ken for his story about letting the child flourish. I think that was very powerful, but can we let the country flourish too, please? If we actually can look after our own folk, control our own taxation, control our own welfare system, then we can deal with those folk down the road who live in a cold house. Mr. Finlay told me he wanted an effective taxation system. I think he also meant an effective welfare system. So do I. And history tells me that we're going to have to do it ourselves. If we leave it elsewhere, it doesn't entirely work. What, however, if these good folk down the road decide to do something about their condition and they try and get some work done on their house? Now, there may be schemes that will pay for it. Let me not worry about that for just half a moment, but in the remaining time, let me consider the folk they might get in to do the work for them. Consumer protection is actually reserved to Westminster. Members may not realise that. We are responsible for consumer education, but actually everything to do with consumer protection and the law around that is reserved to Westminster. And I have to say that with the best efforts of our trading standards officers, who are of course members of local authorities, it doesn't work particularly well. The schemes that are designed to protect people, that are designed to pick out the good tradesmen, Trustmark would be one, do not actually work as well as they should, and they're not actually terribly well supported in Scotland. We have an alternative, it's called the Construction Licensing Executive. I happen to be a director of it, that's not the point, and I derive no benefit from that. But there are Scottish solutions to these problems. It would be so much better, and every trading standards officer in the country will tell you, if this area was actually one that we could worry about in Scotland. We could actually deal with these issues ourselves for the benefit of the Scottish people. And I notice in finishing, presiding officer, the Scottish Government paper on consumer protection and representation in independent Scotland spoke about payday loans, delivery charges and nuisance calling, the kind of things which we actually do want sorted and which we will have to do ourselves because if we leave it to the UK government, it isn't going to work. My passing thought is simply that the post office will be privatised by the time we get the opportunity to rectify that problem. So any future government's actually going to work out what we do about delivery charges and postal services in the independent Scotland, which I'm quite sure the Scottish people will vote for, because actually it is firmly in our interests to do so.
Many thanks. Now call on Kezia Dugdale to be followed by Rob Gibson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Do you know, public trust in the establishment is at an all-time low. Politicians, journalists, banks, reputations are all in the gutter. And if we have a democratic deficit in this country, First Minister, it's not that we only have 59 MPs, it's that only 50% of the population bother to vote in our elections. The referendum offered a real chance to change that, a unique opportunity to re-engage people in politics. If you think, and many people expect, that turnout in the referendum will be high, you could have up to 20% of the population voting for the first time in decades. A real chance to evolutionise how we do our politics and change the way that the public perceive their politicians and how politics is done in our country. But I have to say, so far, I think the vast majority of the public look at the independence debate and think it's a real turn-off, that it's not for them. It's a debate conducted by politicians and political activists in front of audiences who've largely made their minds up already. I've taken part in maybe 15 to 20 different referendum panel debates so far. It's hard to count them because each one was so much like the one before it. But that experience recycled and reinforces that sense of tribalism which is monopolising this debate. And I'm as guilty as the next person of that tribal type of debate, because we're conducting a debate around the independence referendum which is about attacking and rebutting instead of thinking and listening. And it's hardly any wonder that a large number of people around the country don't want any part of that conversation. The real conversations are happening around dinner tables and playgroups and canteens and doorsteps. And when I'm part of those real conversations, what I'm desperately hearing is a call for the facts, information for people to make up their own minds about the referendum and how they're going to vote in that. And the facts are largely absent. And I'm sorry, but the government don't want to hear this. But independence, it's your proposition. It's up to you to lay out the case. It's up to you to put forward the facts and to make the argument for that. I'm sorry, Mr Mason, if you wouldn't mind if I made a bit more progress. But there are two types of facts that come from the Scottish Government, and it depends on what they're being asked. If they're being asked about a popular policy, the answer to that question is, don't worry, that's guaranteed under independence, we will make it so. If the question is a bit harder, or if there is a division over what the answer to that question is, then suddenly that's a matter for the government post-independence. And you can hardly be surprised that that inconsistency fuels a sense of cynicism about the public debate around the independence referendum. And the same argument applies to the sense that we're going to have a written constitution in independent Scotland. On the one hand, I hear the SNP say that they will enshrine certain things in that written constitution. But on the other, they tell us it's for the people to decide what will be in that constitution. It is a cynical ploy, and it's no wonder, presiding officer, that public support for independence is falling. And it's no wonder, presiding officer, that support for the First Minister is falling, because he's been found out. Let me give you an excellent example of where the SNP's inconsistency on this lies, and it's on the issue of payday loans, presiding officer. I've been running a campaign on this issue for about 18 months now. And I have said time and time and again what it is that needs to happen to rid our country, to rid our high streets of this problem. We need to cap the cost of credit, and that is an issue for Westminster. It took the First Minister a year to say in the Sunday Post that the SNP would cap the cost of credit. So then I started to ask some hard questions about how you could do that in an independent country. If we have the same currency, if we have the Bank of England as the bank of last resort, if we then have to have the same system of financial regulation, how could an independent Scotland cap the cost of credit for payday loan countries? Presiding officer, the answer to that lies in the government post-independence. They'll come up with the hard answers on that. Meanwhile, I put forward numerous ideas for things the government could do now to address the problem of payday loans in our communities. And time again, I'm told, oh, that's a bit difficult, or we don't have the powers for that. The political will just simply is not there from the government to make change happen now. And I wondered why. But John Swinney gave the game away last week because it suits this government's agenda to keep people on the hook of debt, struggling to make ends meet. For too many families round the country, there is far too much month left at the end of their money, and this government wants them to wait till 2014 before they'll come up with the answers to help them. So forgive me, presiding officer, for thinking that this debate is increasingly cynical. We need to make sure that when people go to vote, they know what they're voting for. It's up to this government to put forward the proposition and to come up with facts that people can trust. I urge them to do that because we'll all look back and reflect on our politics at the end of this process. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. And now call on Rob Gibson, after which we'll move to closing speeches.
Thank you, presiding officer. I'd like to return to the subject about the abundance of our resources and talent, but also to contrast that with the inability to make the most of these, because I think that that's basically what this argument is about. We've heard about the energy resources of renewables and oil and gas. We've heard about the fact that we've got a land which is potentially there to be developed but is underdeveloped. We've got more peer-reviewed academic papers in the world of academia than any other country's universities in the world. We've indeed got better biodiversity and indeed a more determined climate change mitigation strategy than any part of these islands or indeed of the rest of Europe. But I was reminded this morning about the problems that we face. On Good Morning Scotland, I heard a voter in Sutherland bemoaning the drop in population in that county. They said it was the only county that was losing people, but the Western Isles and many other places are as well. And it drew me to a letter that was in the Herald at the beginning of July from a young woman in Achilty and she said, here in the North West Highlands, young families are rapidly becoming our most endangered species. This year, our school roll drops to 13, the lowest in more than 40 years. Depopulation is happening. For those still left here, following years of economic migration and 2 world wars, it looks like lack of affordable housing and jobs could finish the job off, leaving the Highlands as truly a wild landscape. Presiding Officer, when you look at the way in which local communities want to be able to build houses for themselves, to create jobs, they need energy to do that, and the opportunity of having a community wind farm is one of Julia Campbell's ideas from Achilty. But we can see an energy policy which the Scottish Government can be proud of. As the Audit Scotland message said, the Scottish Government has a clear strategic vision for developing renewable energy, which is reflected across other policy areas. But renewable energy projects are progressing more slowly than anticipated due to factors such as the current economic climate and changes in UK energy policy. We are being held back. I'm sorry I don't have time. We are being held back by policies which on the one hand say, yes, the islands can get more for producing electricity, but no, they're going to have to pay more to get onto the grid. That's the UK policy that's holding us back on energy. That's the UK policy that's no thank you. That's the UK policy which is holding back the people of Achilty and the tenements of Glasgow and wherever. And then there's the Royal Mail, which is going to be privatised. We're not going to be able to get the service to sell the goods which we can do once we have our hands on the broadband that's coming. But we can't get the land on which to build these houses because much of the powers remain in London. And they're not going to end the tax haven status. They're not going to get rid of trust law. We'll have to do that for ourselves. We have to get the powers to do so. And with all due respect, Presiding Officer, when the Leader of the Opposition says that the Land League was something to be proud of, I agree. But they only protested. They didn't get all the land back. We can only do that with the kind of powers that include those that are in Westminster at this moment. And also in terms of our energy, we've got a Crown Estate Commission that's intent on taking a huge chunk of the profits from the kinds of projects which will develop offshore in my constituency and many more. Last week in our committee, the RACI committee, the Crown Estate said, for argument's sake, let us use 2020 projected values. If we think about a round 3 site for 1,000 megawatts of installed capacity, we would expect to receive about £7.6 million per annum. That's the opportunity which could be held in our hands without it being sent as an impost to the Treasury, and that's why we need to control the Crown Estate to empower the coastal communities. But there's many, many more of these at the moment. But I'd like to come to the bedroom tax for a minute, because, you know, the Labour parties, will they, won't they? Will they, won't they keep it, or will they scrap it? Well, we wait to hear with interest. But, you know, there's an old song which I think we should talk about here when we're talking about old songs earlier on. And that's Hamish Henderson's internationalist anthem, the Freedom Come All Ye. He said in the last verse, in your house, all the bairns o' Adam will find breed, barley brie and painted room. We in Scotland aspire to have that potential to give these people that right they have to a house over a roof over their head, the food and the recreation that they deserve as people in our country, and they have been denied that far too often in the past, whether they're in Achilty or in Glasgow or wherever. And I would say to you that that's why I recognise and welcome Presiding Officer, the evidence that shows that there are gains for families and communities when decisions about Scotland are taken by those who care most about Scotland, the people who live and work here. And that's why the challenge of this debate is quite simple. As Hamish Henderson said, "So come all ye at hame with freedom. Never heed what the hoodies croak for doom." I support.
Many thanks. I now call on Jackson Carlaw as we move to the closing speeches. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The First Minister began this afternoon's debate by saying that he hoped it would be based in respect, and the Chamber duly listened to the First Minister with respect. But it was business as usual after that for much of the debate, and I thought that it was an enormous regret that both Joanne Lamont and Ruth Davidson, when they spoke, were barracked throughout. There was a point in the debate where I think the tone changed, and latterly I think there were some thoughtful contributions on all sides which were listened to with more courtesy. The First Minister made one observation in his speech with which I agree, but which I think we should be careful. He said that this is a decision that must be taken by Scots living and working in Scotland, and I agree with that. But because we are members of the United Kingdom today, there are many Scots who have chosen to work, sometimes just temporarily elsewhere in the United Kingdom, with every intention of returning home to Scotland. They may not have a vote next year, but they still have a voice, and what they have to say is relevant and should not be ruled out as being relevant simply because at the moment they don't happen to be residing in Scotland. So we should be careful of the language we use. The vote will be the people of Scotland living in Scotland next year, but the future of Scotland and the future of Scots is something that is of consideration and concern to Scots wherever they are, whether they are in Scotland today or not. Now, why are we having a debate in Parliament today and not a vote in the country? We're having a debate in Parliament today because the government argued that we needed 2.5 years to detail the argument for independence, indeed to argue the detail of independence. And yet 1.5 years into this debate, on all sides, I think the public would say that they are no wiser, no clearer, no more certain of the detailed case for independence about which they will vote next year. And that is why I hope, and I think Kezia Dugdale made an enormously thoughtful contribution that spoke directly to this, that when in November the document is published by the government, they will use that opportunity finally to persuade the people of Scotland that there is an argument that can be tested and which they can put with a degree of certainty and clarity. Because at the moment, people believe they are going to be involved in a further 12 months of debate, at the end of which they will know no more about the decision they have to reach than they could have had if the decision had been taken today. No. However, we may not be voting as a nation today, but all over Scotland, the media and groups are discussing this issue simply because it is 1 year to that final decision. I participated this morning in a debate with the hospitality industry, at which over 200 people were at the National Museum. Employers, educationalists, students, employees within the hospitality industry. The Yes Scotland campaign was led by Jim Mather, by Jean Urquhart and by Andrew Fairley. Before the debate took place, we took a vote on people's intentions. Yes, 5 people. Undecided, 43 people. No, 77. After the vote, yes, 10, undecided 17, no 102. As George Adam might put it, well, I'll come to him in a moment, actually, as one wag nonetheless said, despite being beaten 10-1, the Yes Scotland campaign will no doubt argue that because they doubled their vote, they won the argument. In Aberdeenshire this afternoon, the result of a mock referendum of schools has been announced, the First Minister's heart territory. Yes, school pupils who will be voting, 2,847. No, 8,718. As George Adam might have had it, in the North East, the No campaign had the Yes campaign on toast. There is an argument for independence. It's an argument that I actually thought we would hear from the Yes Scotland and from the SNP. It's an argument which says there are no certainties, that it is a risk, that it is a gamble, that we don't know for sure on a whole range of many areas of what Scotland would be like, but that we believe in the people of Scotland, that we believe that we can actually, faced with the opportunities of independence, rise and meet them and be a successful country. That's actually not the argument that's been put. The argument that has been put, and earlier this summer I was happy to dismiss and to condemn some of the silly stories that are put about, because I think there have been many silly arguments against an independent Scotland, and the mobile phones was one, and I was happy to say so at the time. Because I think that there are very significant issues on which the Yes Scotland campaign have been certain when there is no certainty. And that is on the issues, the big issues, not the trivial ones, the big issues of our currency. Not that we can't participate, that we can have the pound, but on what terms? Not that we can't be in Europe, because I agree, we would ultimately be a value member of the European community. But when and on what terms? The issue of NATO and whether we can be a successor state to NATO.
Mr Carroll, I need to come to a conclusion.
I've had 6 minutes. Sorry.
It's now 5:34.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, you could have interrupted me rather sooner than I expected.
I'm just reminding you about your time, Mr Carroll. You've got 6 minutes.
Well, I was the first to be reminded, Presiding Officer. In 12 months' time, I really think that was most unreasonable of you, Presiding Officer, to intervene.
Mr Carroll,
30
you've got
seconds
6 minutes.
Yeah, I had 6 minutes, and you've occupied 30 seconds of them.
Mr Carroll, can I ask you to resume your seat? I call Drew Smith. You've got 8 minutes, Mr Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by congratulating Cameron Buchanan for his thoughtful contribution, and particularly his sincere tribute to our late colleague, Mr McCletchie. One would be forgiven, Presiding Officer, for the impression that every single day in a separate Scotland would be an historic day. But I'm not sure that history will long remember this debate this afternoon, because the truth is that we have heard nothing new this afternoon. We welcome this milestone in the referendum debate, not just as a chance to vindicate our party politics, but because it represents 1 year until the Scottish people have their chance to decide on the independence question. The choice facing the people of Scotland is whether to go alone or whether to continue working together with the people of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. These are our partners as well as our neighbours, and we have built the United Kingdom together. On this side, the solidarity and partnership we have with the rest of the British Labour movement is important to us, and we know that our greatest achievements, the welfare state, our National Health Service, our commitment to international development, are achievements that progressive people in every part of the UK have achieved together. Devolution, this Scottish Parliament, was not achieved only by pressure within Scotland, but because legislation was passed in the UK Parliament which reflected our desire for both effective home rule and a continuing partnership across the whole of the country. It is not, Presiding Officer, devolution that is broken, but rather this Scottish Government which is failing to put the people's priorities at the heart of this Parliament's business. Under the SNP, Scotland is on pause. It is the SNP which seek to denigrate devolution, to focus not on what this Parliament can do for Scotland, but on the grievances of nationalists against the rest of Britain. I very much welcome Mr MacDonald's sandwich heckling in these debates. We enjoyed his loudness at the beginning, and perhaps he could have contributed throughout the debate if he had something to say at the end. Last week we had a budget for independence which failed to set out a plan for growing jobs and our economy. The week before, we had a legislative programme which showed the SNP's lack of ambition, holding Scotland back because they think that undermining Scotland's confidence in devolution is the only way they could ever convince enough Scots to take a chance with separation. It is therefore no surprise that we have heard the usual litany of complaints from the SNP this afternoon, other than, of course, from Christine Graham, who must win some kind of positivity prize at the SNP Christmas party this year. We reject the notion that the union must be broken in order to bring about the change we would wish to see in our country, either here in Scotland or in the rest of Britain. The question is, as many members actually across the chamber have said, that it is not whether Scotland could be an independent country, but whether or not it wants to be. We, as Malcolm Chisholm said, believe in the best of both worlds. A strong Scottish Parliament focused on Scotland's priorities, and a strong United Kingdom in which we share and pool both our resources and the risks we face together. We have said this afternoon that we welcome the people of Scotland, not just Scotland's politicians, having their say on this question next year. It is the people who are demanding information about the SNP's plans for a separate Scotland, and it is they whom the nationalists need to convince. Certainly.
Donald.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. If the people are demanding information about independence, and I agree they are, I think they are also demanding information about the alternative, which is the union.
Drew Smith.
I have no disagreement with Mrs MacDonald on that point, and we therefore need to move beyond a point where every time someone raises a question, they are accused of scaremongering. So far, the signs that the SNP... I apologise, Presiding Officer, I seem to have inadvertently hit the button which activates the chips on the SNP's backbenchers' shoulders. So far, the signs that the SNP are rising to the challenge of their own objective are not encouraging. Scottish ministers have been caught out saying one thing about independence in private, something else entirely in public. Deficits are turned into relative surplus. Legal advice on EU membership is asserted to exist on television, only for it to turn out that it was not even commissioned at that point. The imagination of the SNP in bending what independence means, and has always meant to some of the contributors to this debate, to mean something else entirely, knows no bounds of principle nor practicality. The party which trumpeted its disarmament credentials when their policies were not subject to scrutiny now wishes to shelter under NATO's nuclear umbrella, so long as someone else holds the umbrella up for them. Former Republicans now reassure Scots of a royalist persuasion that they want a monarchical union with England. Welfare arrangements can be shared, while at the same time transformed to reflect undefined Scottish values, and Linda Fabiani again today completely failed to define what these values might mean. The continual reassessment of the limits of independence by its longest-standing supporters reflects a desire not to lead Scots to voting yes, but to wear them down.
Mr Doris, the member is not given way. Sit down.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Over the last year, we have witnessed a Scottish Government which will say anything if it helps their case, no matter whether it reflects their real views or whether it would actually damage Scotland rather than help it. The Bank of England is to be Scotland's lender of last resort, yet Scotland is to have no say in setting the interest rates of Scots with mortgages to pay. We've had no answers on pension arrangements after independence, and we're expected to support financial regulation being made in London, whilst at the same time withdrawing our representation from the places where decisions are made. The SNP are not presenting a vision for Scotland so much as a case for themselves. On this side, we have put forward our view that whilst devolution is essential for Scotland, union and partnership is needed too. We hope and believe that this will be the choice which Scotland makes for itself next year. The choice we face is not Scotland versus England. The debate we have had this afternoon has been one between Scots about the best future for Scotland. During this debate, Labour members have questioned the assertion before us today that only independence can solve inequality. This flies in the face of evidence, just one example, Presiding Officer, of evidence I heard when I was a member of the Health and Sport Committee from Kate Pickett, who knows a thing or two about equality in this country. And she said it was the duty of decision makers at every level to make policy which sought to reduce inequality. She was clear there is no silver bullet power or policy which solves these problems. The most progressive decisions are taken by the most progressive people. Where they live really has nothing whatsoever to do with it. It was therefore correct of Ken Macintosh to point out that the decimation of the college sector by the SNP does not help. Turning this place into a talking shop to avoid defending the decisions which this Scottish Government have taken themselves does not help. And a bonus for big business with tax competition for corporations won't help Scotland any more than it will help people in the rest of the UK, who will all lose out as a result. Certainly, Mr
MacDonald.
The member's leader said that her mind was changed on devolution when she saw the impact of the Thatcher policies on the children she taught. Does the member not look at what is happening to disabled people in Scotland under this Tory government and reflect on the fact that we would perhaps be better taking decisions on welfare in this chamber?
Drew Smith. Mr Smith.
I can only assume that Mr MacDonald was not convinced by the case for independence, by the current welfare policies of this current Scottish Government. And this is the fallacy of the case that the SNP are presenting. I'm pretty sure that Mr MacDonald supported independence as the answer to every policy question Scotland faces, and indeed the rest of the UK faces, and did it long before the election of the current Conservative Government, which of course the First Minister advised people in Scotland to vote Liberal Democrat. No one in this debate, not even Neil Findlay, put it any better than the much-quoted Professor Stiglitz when he said, "Some of you have been told that lowering tax rates..." I'd certainly, Presiding Officer, I'll leave Professor Stiglitz for another day then. Over the years, independence has been the SNP's answer, whatever the question. Now that it is the people's turn to ask the questions, it is the SNP's independence answer which sounds less and less convincing. The amendment which Joanne Lamont has put forward today recognises that the people who should be at the heart of this debate, and it is they who will take this decision. We look forward to their positive endorsement of Scotland's place in the Union, a strong Scottish Parliament and a strong United Kingdom.
I now call on Nicola Sturgeon to wind up the debate. Deputy First Minister, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also begin today by congratulating Cameron Buchanan on a very eloquent maiden speech in this Parliament and for his very moving words about his predecessor. I also want to thank everybody who's taken part in this debate. I think there have been some genuinely excellent speeches on both sides of the debate. I don't want to start on a negative note, but I want to get this out of the way at the start, because I genuinely can't decide whether Tavish Scott's speech was the most depressing point of the debate or the most ridiculous point of the debate. I mean, I accept that it must have been a real strain for Tavish Scott to have to explain to the poor passenger at Edinburgh Airport why the UK is perfectly happy to be in a passport-free common travel area with independent Ireland, but somehow wouldn't want to do that with independent Scotland. Now, that must have been a difficult conversation to have, Mr Scott, but it's no excuse for Tavish Scott's characterisation of independence or the independence debate. I think what he said was that it would, but let me just finish, I'll give way later on, it would pitch us into a pitch-black room from which we'll never get out. Tavish Scott should try telling that to the 150 countries across the world that have become independent in the past 60 years, not one of which wants to go back the way. The only pitch-black room that Scotland has been cast into is the one marked Tory government propped up by the Liberals, the government we didn't vote for. You know, as I listen to some of the contributions, and as I listen to some of the wider contributions in this debate, I'm often reminded of an old leaflet that I came across recently. It's an old leaflet from another No campaign. Let me just quote some of it. Vote no because a yes means competition instead of cooperation. Vote no because the alternative can be of no benefit compared with the additional expense involved. Vote no because it's unwise to risk the good we already have for all the evil that might occur. That was the Vote No campaign against votes for women. And the reason I quote that is because it so often strikes me that every progressive campaign in our history has been met with a kind of dreary, can't do, it's all too risky, let's just stay as we are arguments that we heard from Ruth Davidson earlier on. Yes.
Ruth Davidson. I thank the member for giving way. From her side of the argument, we've had the devolution argument of 97, we've had the poll tax, we've had the winter of discontent, a tour of Harold Wilson's government, Black Wednesday, and now votes for women. Given this historical analysis, does she recognise the words of Alex Bell, up until very recently head of her own policy unit, which says that their campaign is relying on tedious ideas, tired policies, and that Alex Salmond has got his approach thoroughly wrong?
Actually, the words of Alex Bell that I preferred, and I expect this will be of more interest to those in this side of the chamber, for many of us, the nationalist case represents what the Labour Party could be if it had a spine. That, I think, is a phrase I can agree with. But the reason I quoted the leaflet against women's suffrage is that all of these progressive campaigns have faced these kind of voices. And the fact of the matter is, just as those who said no to votes for women were wrong, just as those who said no to the establishment of this Parliament were wrong, so too are those today who say no to independence wrong, and they will be proved wrong. You know, Joanne Lamont criticised the First Minister in her speech for having campaigned for and believed in independence for 40 years. That comment said more about Labour than it did about the First Minister, because obviously sticking to a principle that you believe in is an alien concept to people in the Labour Party these days. Yes.
Joanne Lamont. Order. Ms Lamont.
The First Minister will argue for independence regardless of what government's in power, regardless of what situation is, and regardless if the evidence will damage the people of Scotland. He believes in that. That's not a journey. That's simply being obdurate.
Deputy First Minister.
The First Minister sticks to his principles and argues for what he believes is right for Scotland. Joanne Lamont argued against devolution in 1979. She was wrong then, she's wrong now, and she'll be proved wrong in the years to come. Presiding Officer, I want to make three key arguments for the case for independence today. The first is Scotland can afford to be an independent country. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It is a fact that for each and every one of the past 30 years, oil prices high, oil prices low, we have generated more tax per head than the rest of the UK. Malcolm Chisholm, a man I have the utmost respect for, gave us figures earlier on that saying welfare spending was about 60 quid higher per head in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. That's correct. What he didn't say was in the exact same year we contributed £1,700 more in tax. Let it not be said by anyone in this chamber that Scotland cannot afford to be independent. The question is not whether we have the wealth to be independent. The question is, are we going to access that wealth to build the better country that we want Scotland to be?
Malcolm Chisholm.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving me once again quoting figures selectively. Will she not answer the more substantive point I made about only 6 of the last 22 years when the revenue percentage of the UK was above the expenditure? She's not taking account of Scottish expenditure when she quotes figures on tax.
Whatever way you cut the figures, Scotland's public finances are in better shape than the UK's public finances. But the benefit of independence is having the powers to grow our economy faster, to create more wealth so that we can challenge some of the issues that we face. Because you know what? Being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, while having some of the highest levels of child poverty, cannot be an argument for staying the same. It's an argument for doing things differently, for doing things better. It is an argument for being independent. And can I say to Tavish Scott, I will take a more prosperous Scotland, a more socially just Scotland with a decent welfare state over nuclear weapons and a seat on the UN Security Council any day of the week. Officer, my second argument is that it is better that we take decisions here in Scotland. Joanne Lamont accepts that principle but can't bring herself to take it to its logical conclusion, so she tied herself in knots. Apparently that principle means coming out of the EU. Forget that it's the UK that want to take us out of the EU, but she misses the point that being independent means we choose when we share sovereignty and when we don't. Under the current system, it's Westminster that decides what powers this Parliament has and what powers it doesn't. And no one can explain to me why it can be right, as it is, for us to have the power to protect our NHS from privatisation, but to have to stand by while our welfare state is destroyed. Labour say that's about pooling resources. You know, the giants of the Labour movement must spin in their graves when they hear that, because the reality of welfare cuts is not the pulling of resources, it's the pulling the rug from under the feet of the poor and vulnerable in our society. That's the reality. And can I say to Malcolm Chisholm, I believe in social solidarity as much and as passionately as you do. But I believe we display more solidarity with the poor and vulnerable in England if we take the powers to lead by example and abolish the bedroom tax, not to say that everybody has to suffer under it. And my third and final argument, presiding officer, is that this debate is not about the SNP. You know, you can think, as I do, that the SNP is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Or you can think, like Neil Findlay does, that we're the devil incarnate. That's not the point. Independence is about having the power to decide, the power to choose. It's about where power and decision-making lies. It's about whether we always get the governments we vote for, or whether we have to put up with governments, Tories propped up by Liberals, that we don't vote for, something that we've had for more than half of my life. So this debate, presiding officer, is once in a lifetime. I believe we all have to do it justice. I really do believe that people a year from today will reject the fears and the smears. They will opt for the hope, the optimism, the human instinct to strive to build a better world, starting with building a better country, the better country that we know Scotland can be. I'm looking forward to this debate. I'm looking forward to making the argument, and I believe that, just as the BBC audience in Berwick did last night, the Scottish population will also come to the yes side and vote for independence for our country.
Order. That concludes the debate on Scotland's future. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 7725 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion 7725.
Formally moved, presiding officer.
No member is asked to speak against the motion. Mr Stewart, Mr Stevenson, have you pressing your button to move against it? Thank you. Could you? Thank you. No member, including Mr Stevenson, has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 7725, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. I ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 7726 on the establishment of a committee.
Formally moved, presiding officer.
This motion will be put at decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 7721.1 in the name of Joanne Lamont, which seeks to amend motion number 7721 in the name of Alex Salmond on Scotland's future be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote. The result of the vote on amendment number 7721.1 in the name of Joanne Lamont is as follows. Yes, 50. No, 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7721 in the name of Alex Salmond on Scotland's future be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should pass their votes now. Of the vote on motion number 7721 in the name of Alex Salmond is as follows. Yes, 66. No, 49. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7726 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on establishment of a committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving should do so quickly and quietly.
The final item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 7599 in the name of Nanette Milne on Marie Curie signpost to palliative care. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could please press the request to speak buttons now. I call on Nanette Milne to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to have been given the opportunity to lead a parliamentary discussion on the report How Good is Primary Care at Identifying Patients Who Need Palliative Care, just 9 days after its publication in the European Journal of Palliative Care. And I thank all those MSPs who have supported my motion since it was lodged last week. The report was the result of a collaborative study by Marie Curie Cancer Care, the University of Edinburgh and NHS Lothian, led by Professor Scott Murray and Dr. Lillian Zheng of the university. And I'd like to flag up a North East connection because Professor Murray began his career in primary care as a trainee in the Elmbank practice in Aberdeen, where my husband was a partner. This study was the first in the UK to examine the point at which patients are formally identified for palliative care, and it obtained its information from the experience of 684 patients across 9 Scottish GP practices. It found that whilst 75% of cancer patients were identified for palliative care before dying, only 20% of patients with organ failure as a result of chronic heart, lung, liver or kidney disease, or with dementia, either asked for or were identified for palliative care, and most patients received it too late to gain full benefit from it, as on average, care was initiated just 8 weeks before death. The study also found that few patients openly admitted that they might die, put off by the negative connotations and lack of understanding around terms such as palliative and hospice. And sadly, GPs found it difficult to discuss death and dying with their patients, particularly those with a non-cancer diagnosis, even though doctors recognised that open discussion is helpful for patients, their relatives and those taking care of them. The task of identifying patients who would benefit from palliative care was easier for GPs if patients and/or family members asked them for information and extra support, and specific tools such as multidisciplinary meetings and national guidance were of help to them in making decisions around formally identifying these patients. The World Health Organization has stated that all patients with a life-threatening condition can benefit from palliative care, which it recommends should be phased in from the point of diagnosis. However, currently, many such patients are not being identified, either in hospital or in primary care, and the resultant late access to palliative care limits the opportunities to improve the quality of life of patients in their last year of life. The study concludes with 4 recommendations: that patients diagnosed with life-threatening illnesses should be encouraged to discuss and plan their future care so that their wishes can be accommodated, and that doctors and nurses should offer supportive and palliative care to more people with such conditions. The Scottish taboo around talking about death should be tackled, and the report considers that the Scottish Government should lead a public discussion around the issues of death and promote more widely its national plan for palliative care, the Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief initiative. Finally, all doctors and nurses should be trained in how to identify when patients need palliative care support, in addition to the normal treatment for their condition. And this training should include supporting health professionals to have conversations about death and dying. There's no rocket science about any of this, but if these recommendations were to be taken on board, many more patients and their families would be helped towards a positive end-of-life experience through the prevention and relief of suffering by the early identification, assessment and treatment of pain and the associated physical, psychosocial and spiritual problems, and through being given the choice about where they want to be cared for and where they wish to die. So I would ask the Minister, in his response to the debate, what plans there are, in conjunction with the Royal College of General Practitioners, to review the training of GPs and primary care staff to help them towards better communication with their terminally ill patients and to ensure that more non-cancer patients access palliative care in the last year of their lives. I'd also ask the Government, particularly at this time when we'll soon be hearing the arguments for and against Margaret MacDonald's proposals for patient autonomy in deciding when to end life, how and when it will initiate a public debate on death and dying in an attempt to overcome the taboo which currently surrounds the issue in Scotland. Finally, Presiding Officer, I would like to thank Richard Meade of Marie Curie for his help in preparing for this debate, and to pay tribute to Marie Curie Cancer Care for the huge amount of work it does in Scotland and across the UK for patients with terminal illness. We've all heard of Marie Curie nurses, but the breadth and extent of the charity's work is not so well known. It's 740 employees in Scotland, it's 300 plus volunteers, and the 3,000 plus people who collected for this year's Great Daffodil Appeal mean that nearly 4,500 patients in 31 out of 32 Scottish local authorities are supported by nearly 400 Marie Curie nurses, giving them excellent end-of-life care and the choice to die at home if that is what they wish. Research shows that although the vast majority of people wish to die at home or in a hospice, nearly 60% of deaths in Scotland actually occur in a hospital. And I firmly believe that without the support of Marie Curie nurses, that proportion would be significantly higher. Well over 900 patients have been cared for in the Marie Curie hospices in Edinburgh and Glasgow in the past year, and nearly 5,000 have been supported in the community in these two cities alone. Marie Curie also provides emotional support and companionship for many patients with terminal illness and supports their families and carers after the patient has died through its bereavement support services. Moreover, the charity, as well as doing its own research, funds one of the largest palliative care research programmes in the UK. Much of this research is collaborative, such as the study we're discussing today, and is aimed at finding practical ways to improve the care of terminally ill patients from whatever cause and their families. Presiding Officer, there's much more I could say about Marie Curie Cancer Care, but I'll leave it to others to fill in the gaps that I've left. But I look forward to hearing the debate, and I congratulate all the contributors to a very important study on access to palliative care for publishing such a comprehensive report. I commend it to the Minister and to Parliament. Thank you.
Many thanks. Before I call Malcolm Chisholm, could I just remind the Chamber that mobile phones should be switched off as well as other devices, unless the devices are being used to deliver a speech, in which case they should be on silent. Speeches of 4 minutes, please, and I call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by George Adam.
Presiding Officer, I congratulate Nanette Milne for bringing forward this important issue to the Chamber today, and I'd also like to congratulate Marie Curie Cancer Care for their involvement in the work and all the other superb work, the superb contribution they make towards palliative care. Now, as the report that they are associated with confirms, there is a huge disparity between the 75% of cancer patients being identified and the 20% from the non-cancer group. And in non-cancer patients, what support is given is often too little, too late. These include patients diagnosed with heart, lung, liver or kidney organ failure and with dementia. The research team, which investigated the cases of 684 patients from 9 GP practices, concluded that a gradual and long-term approach to phasing in supportive and palliative care while continuing with other treatment care planning would benefit patients and their families. And can I make 3 general points, which I think perhaps are not necessary to make to members in the Chamber, but in terms of people outside, I would like to make 3 general points about palliative care. Firstly, in terms of what is palliative care, it's a proactive approach, and this is the definition from the Scottish Partnership for Palliative Care, a proactive approach involving a multi-professional team, as well as controlling pain and other distressing symptoms. It applies a holistic approach to meeting the physical, practical, functional, social, emotional and spiritual needs of patients and carers facing progressive illness and bereavement. The second point I would make is, of course, it's not location-specific and can take place in the community as well as in the hospices that are well known to everybody. And thirdly, GPs keep a register, a palliative care register, and it's from that register that the 20% figure derives. Now, as the motion points out, breaking the stigma of simply talking about death is fundamental. The campaign highlighted in the motion, Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief, not only supports those going through the death and grieving process, but also seeks to normalise the process and open up conversations on the issues surrounding it. They, like the report, point out that it is never too early to think about planning ahead for illness and death, as making plans when you're healthy means the pressure of making these crucial decisions is lessened at the point when sickness takes hold. Professor Scott McMurray from the University of Edinburgh, who was involved with the research, points out that, and I'm quoting here, if we are going to better improve the chances for everyone with both cancer and non-cancer diagnoses to benefit from palliative care, doctors and nurses should be comfortable and able to talk to and listen to patients when they want to talk about death and dying. The big challenge for patients is to talk about how you feel and what you would like if you become ill, so that your relatives and friends and doctors know what to do. That's the end of the quote. Only by doing this will we be able to ensure the maximum numbers of people receive the emotional, spiritual and practical support through services that all patients deserve. This is beginning to happen as we speak in the Lothians, where a complete redesign of the NHS palliative care programme is being directed by Marie Curie in partnership with NHS Lothian, and they should also be congratulated in terms of their association with the research and the University of Edinburgh. Using a whole systems approach to delivery, they hope to reduce the number of avoidable emergency admissions and give patients the choice of place of death, working to improve the community-based model of end-of-life care and make the process less intimidating for those involved. Based on the delivering choice model, which was found to be successful in Somerset, the redesign will involve 3 key stages of design and implementation. It is hoped that by effectively assessing need at a local level, services can be developed so that they operate more effectively, whilst ensuring local clinical staff are engaged with the process and have ownership over the models. Finally, continued support is necessary in the implementation of the redesigned structures throughout the area. This consultative approach between the NHS and Marie Curie in providing a more accessible and coherent framework for care delivery has been seen to work elsewhere, and therefore I'm glad to see it being implemented in this area. Finally, I congratulate Nanette Mill once again for bringing this motion today, and I wholeheartedly support it.
Many thanks, and I now call George Adam to be followed by Michael McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank Nanette Milne for bringing this debate to the Parliament and Marie Curie on the report that they've provided, How Good is Primary Care and Identify Patients Who Need Palliative Care. I welcome the report and what it brings to the debate, because palliative care offers support to patients and their families at a time when they really need it, and it can be an extremely difficult time for members of the families as well. And during that time in Renfrewshire, we are served by 2 hospices. Obviously, the Accord Hospice in Paisley and St Vincent's Hospice in Renfrewshire and Johnston, who both offer care and support for families when it comes to their time of death. And the support they offer is absolutely fantastic. As a politician, you find yourself talking about palliative care and talking about the Accord and some of the work they do and congratulate them on a regular basis. But when you do go through it yourself, you see it for what it really is. And when my mum was diagnosed with cancer earlier this year, died in August, the Accord Hospice was absolutely incredible. She got that opportunity, she was lucky to be there. But when they discussed palliative care to her at the early stages of her diagnosis, she actually panicked. The taboo was there with her as the individual who was dealing with it, and she wouldn't have the conversation with us. I spent hours talking to her, as other family members have done with their own family, just to say, no, this is about getting you home, this is about making sure you can have palliative care in the home, and that was the original plan. But things moved on, things got worse, and I agree with some of the things, the 4 points, the recommendations that the report brings up. I would have agreed with it beforehand, but again, it only reinforces it when you actually go through that yourself. Patients with life-threatening illnesses should take every opportunity to raise and plan their future care according to their own wishes. Yes, but we have to get over the taboo. We have to get over the idea of both family members and individuals being able to talk to one another about that, because it can become quite, it's something that's difficult for us all to actually deal with, and the fact that the taboo is still there. You know, we had, I know the government's got the Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief initiative, and I think this is something that we need to make sure that more people know about, so that we can actually, when other families are in that type of position, they don't have to go through that kind of difficulty. And it's one of these things that we have to ensure that all people, families within that position, get that opportunity to be able to say that, you know, there's something more, because you could have a situation where someone could give up themselves at that stage, thinking that palliative care means that they're heading straight for a hospice, and that clearly is not the case with a lot of the things that happen. I have to go on again in my own personal care and take this opportunity to say how the Accord Hospice in Paisley were absolutely fantastic with my own mother, and palliative care is just incredible. When you move your family there, it can be quite a shock to yourself, because personally your family, you go full circle from your mother feeding and looking after you to you doing the same, and they ask you if you want to do that, and it can be awkward for you to actually say you don't want to say no, but you feel awkward because, you know, you want to look after your mother or father in their last days. And I would just like to thank Nanette Mill for bringing this debate to the Parliament and giving me an opportunity to talk about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I now call Michael McMahon to be followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by congratulating Nanette Milne for securing this evening's debate, which allows us to speak positively about the role of palliative care in Scotland. I would also like to commend Marie Curie Cancer Care, the University of Edinburgh and NHS Lothian for producing their study, which was published recently. I'd like to focus on the section in Nanette Milne's motion, which highlights the reality that we in Scotland have a real collective difficulty when it comes to talking about death. Death, dying and bereavement affect all of us, yet talking about and planning for the experiences and practicalities associated with death, dying and bereavement can be difficult. We just do not open up as a country when it comes to talking about the subject of dying and bereavement, and that is not good for us as individuals or as a society. Indeed, the studies have shown that unnecessary harm is caused because people in Scotland are not open about the subject. And as a study we are discussing tonight found, GPs can find it difficult to discuss death and dying with patients. Few patients openly discuss that they might die, though doctors feel it can be helpful. And a lack of understanding around terms such as palliative and hospice can be barriers for starting palliative care and support. But it doesn't have to be this way. At a meeting of the cross-party group on palliative care a few years ago, we had a presentation from palliative care specialists who had recently returned from West Africa, where they had witnessed an entirely different culture towards death and dying that exists there. Professor Scott Murray, one of the authors of the report, was one of those specialists. And they told us that they'd gone out to learn about the delivery of palliative medicines, but were struck most not by the difficulties which faced medical practitioners in the developing world in delivering adequate palliation in challenging circumstances of high mortality rates and severe poverty, but by the way in which death and bereavement is celebrated in those cultures. Another CPG meeting was on the history of death and dying in Scotland, and I was amazed at just how much of an impact the Reformation had had in creating the closed culture around death which pervades Scottish society still today. As a member of the Irish Catholic community in Scotland, I'm familiar with wakes, and I found it fascinating to learn of the strictures placed by the Church of Scotland on burials and associated rituals. Now, I'm pleased that those restrictions have loosened over time, but there remains some way to go before Scotland becomes more comfortable about burials in future than it was allowed to be in the past. So I particularly welcome the creation of the Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief initiative, which seeks to engage, support and enhance the assets of organisations and individuals who have the potential to improve the experience of death, dying and bereavement in Scotland. Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief is an alliance of over 700 organisations and individuals who believe that Scotland should be a place where people can be open about death, dying and bereavement. And I believe that Scottish society would benefit from being more open to death, the dead and dying. We would become more aware of the options and choices that are available when we are faced with the end of life. Health and social care professionals and volunteers in all care settings would undoubtedly feel better about being able to discuss with patients and their families and friends a wider range of issues relating to death and bereavement. So if people were better placed to talk about death and deal with related issues in a constructive way, there would be more effective support for those dealing with death and bereavement. The death is an inevitable part of life, but we could face it better if we could make palliative care more available, accessible and appropriate to meet the various needs of each individual person requiring additional care to live well until it's time for them to go and leave the rest of us behind to celebrate their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Jim Hume to be followed by Neil Finlay.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I want to first, of course, also begin by congratulating Nanette Milne on securing this evening's very important debate. It gives us opportunity to discuss an important publication and the wider issue of provision of palliative care in Scotland. The publication of the Scottish Government's first action plan on palliative care, Living and Dying Well, back in 2008, was a welcome step. There had clearly been issues in both identifying those whose medical condition made them appropriate recipients of palliative care and then ensuring that those people did indeed receive it. That report acknowledged this by stating to date, however, the provision of specialist services for palliative and end-of-life care in Scotland is known to be directly mainly to people with cancer, with a greater range of services available to cancer patients and their families. That was true in 2008 and unfortunately still is true. NHS Lothian, University of Edinburgh, Marie Curie Cancer Care themselves all deserve great credit for the work they did on the publication which we debate tonight. The findings are quite stark, in some cases shocking, and provide a clarion call to action. The fact that only 1 in 5 patients dying from non-cancer diseases receive palliative care is a shame to us all, particularly when this was identified as a problem in the national strategy 5 years ago. The Scottish Government has made progress. Palliative care guidelines have been developed. We are now the first country in Europe to have implemented a national electronic system for communicating and anticipatory care planning for palliative care patients and the Do Not Attempt Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation policy, which has been developed. But as I say, there's much to do still. One of the more enlightening areas of the research came from the views of the health professionals. It's clear that GPs across Scotland are having real difficulty in identifying which non-cancer patients are appropriate for palliative care. And they're also having difficulty in discussing death and dying with non-cancer patients with life-threatening conditions. This is an incredibly delicate and sensitive topic, and no one envies this particular task that is faced by our GPs. But it seems to me that this is something which could be tackled with perhaps some targeted training for GPs in palliative care. A critical feature of a GP's role is to speak with patients about their end-of-life care. If they're having difficulty in doing so, then this is something the Scottish Government may investigate. Perhaps a working group of general practitioners could engage with those behind the Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief initiative to establish how to better enable GPs to have these extremely difficult but necessary conversations and tackle the taboo, as it were. Deputy Presiding Officer, 60% of patients die in hospital, with the vast majority wishing to die at home or a hospice, as Nanette Milne has already said. And that's understandable. I therefore believe we have a long way to go yet, that we need to use the integration of social care and health as a golden opportunity to increase the opportunity to pass away in the familiar surrounds of our homes. It's also in the interest of all of us to ensure that those in their most vulnerable hour receive the finest care appropriate to their needs. Not only does it alleviate the patient's suffering, but it also represents significant savings for the NHS by supporting the patient's end-of-life care earlier and in a place of their choosing. Thank you.
Many thanks. And the final open debate speaker is Neil Finlay.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. As many people have mentioned, Scots are not very good at dealing with these types of things, and death is a time that brings out very much the best and worst in people. Very often we don't like dealing with all of the practicalities surrounding death and expressing our emotions and taking time to look at the practical steps that we need to take. These are things that we do our best to avoid until we have to do it. And we don't tell people closest to us simple things like how much we love them, and we don't do that until it's too late. Often we don't address key divisions in our families, things that have burned away in our families for it can be generations until time is at its very shortest. And this can be a healing time and a healing process, but it can also cause many further divisions that have leave people with lifelong regrets, the people who are left behind. As the report suggests, patients are offered palliative care often very late, and by the time they are, the experience of going through the planning for death often leaves a real pressure on the families who have to help the sufferer and the people in hospital who have to deal with them in their final days. And I agree with Annette Milne that we need a national debate and a discussion about these very important issues. If we are to become more comfortable talking about these issues and many of the related issues, for example, spiritual, medical, relationship, financial and other issues, then if we can take that debate to a more mature level, then that will not just help patients and their extended families and friends, but everyone affected by someone who is in that position. When my father was in the Marie Curie Hospice in Edinburgh, their help and support was absolutely fantastic to my family, but it came very late in the day. And that certainly was not their fault. That probably was ours, because we did as other people do, and that is avoid the issue until death is almost imminent. People do need to talk about death and dying and share those feelings, fears and medical needs. And I think also people do have a lack of understanding about what palliative care is. I certainly did until it came to my doorstep. My wife works in the NHS as a clinical support worker, often providing palliative care to cancer sufferers. And the heartwarming stories that she tells me of people, the humility of people, the humanity of people, reconciliation of families, people finding peace with themselves through that period, that is greatly assisted. All of that is greatly assisted with the care and the carers who help them through that time. A very simple thing. My wife used to be a hairdresser, so if someone who is receiving palliative care, they maybe want their hair cut or their hair done, it makes them feel so much better, a simple act like that. And they're sort of minor issues, but to the person who's receiving them, that is a major issue, a minor issue to us. So I think we all want to die with dignity, and this report, I hope, takes us down the road towards a mature debate about these matters. On a lighter note, and on this issue, there ain't many light notes, but a few weeks ago was cycling along the canal near canal in West Lothian. In fact, it was last year, and I met a guy walking his dog, and I asked him where he was going that evening, and he was going to a dying party. He was going to a dying party. I said, what do you mean a dying party? And his friend was dying and only had a few weeks to live, but he had paid for a party in the pub for all his pals to come, and they were having a great big send-off for him. That was someone who is at peace with themselves and is moving on into a better place, hopefully. I think there's a lesson in that for many of us.
Thank you very much. Can I now invite Michael Matheson to respond to the debate? Minister, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I, like others, congratulate Annette Milne on securing time for this debate, and also to take this opportunity to thank Marie Curie, University of Edinburgh and NHS Lothian for producing this particular report. I think all members who have considered the report would recognise this is not a report which is about criticising what is there. It's about recognising what is there and how it can be improved yet further, and where the areas of improvement need to be made, because it's in all of our interest to make sure the palliative care is provided at the appropriate time, in a person-centred way and in a safe and effective way for that person, not only to help to improve the situation for the cared for person, but also for their family at that vital time at the end of someone's life. And it's important we all recognise that I think historically in the past there has been a great tendency to focus on palliative care as being something which is a province of the hospice setting or within the acute setting. And a great deal of palliative care nowadays is provided within a community setting and led on by our primary care teams. And I think it's important we recognise that that in itself brings some challenges for the primary care team in addressing some of the issues with patients and their families within a community setting. But nevertheless, it's important that we look at what action we can take in order to try to help to improve this area of work, improving this area of work, and to find means in which to achieve that. And the report illustrates very clearly that there is more progress that needs to be made. The report in itself also acknowledges the importance of the work that has already been taken forward. Our Living and Dying Well National Action Plan is already addressing a number of the key issues that have been highlighted in this particular report, and the report also identifies some of the factors that have already been taken forward as part of the National Action Plan that have improved the situation, like the national guidance and the payment structures. But again, I do recognise there is a need for further action to be taken forward. The way in which we seek to take forward policy in this area from a government's perspective is in a collaborative way, working in partnership with the wider sector in order to try and make sure that we take forward the National Action Plan appropriately and that we have the right priorities. And our work in the Living and Dying Well advisory group is crucial to assisting us in taking that forward and helping to support the work that we need to take forward within NHS Scotland and wider. The other thing which I think is extremely important here is that I think there is some work we need to do in making sure there is a equitability of approach across the country. That doesn't mean it has to be the same in every part of the country, but patients in the Grampian area should expect to receive the same type of palliative care support within a primary care setting as a patient in Falkirk or in Glasgow. And there is work for us to do to make sure that we do that in a more consistent way. The National Action Plan tries to take some of that work forward. I think one of the things that is particularly interesting within this report is the numbers of those patients who do not have a cancer diagnosis that then have difficulty in accessing palliative care, whether that's a lack of professionals recognising to engage with them to discuss palliative care, given the nature of their condition, whether it's other factors. No matter what it is, I think it recognises the need for us to look at palliative care in a much more holistic basis. And the National Action Plan is very clear. It focuses on the person, not the condition. And we need to make sure that palliative care is provided in that holistic way, in the definition that Malcolm Chisholm offered in his contribution, from the physical to the practical, to the functional, the social, to the spiritual and the emotional parts of it. So it's important that it is looked upon in that holistic context. A key part of addressing some of these issues is appropriate planning. Planning through anticipatory care planning is an important element to making sure that we have our primary care colleagues in a position where they are able to manage these issues more effectively. Jim Humany's contribution made reference to the fact that we've done a lot of work in helping to improve anticipatory care planning within the general practitioner setting. That in itself is starting to reap some reward and helping to facilitate some improvements. But clearly we need to build further progress on that, and I think we need to make sure that we look at how we can integrate that much more effectively between GP, the wider primary care team, including groups such as pharmacists, making sure that they are seen as being part of that team and helping to manage someone's palliative care provision. Can I also say a number of members have made reference to public attitudes towards death and dying, and I'm sure all members would recognise that none of these are issues which will be addressed quickly or easily. There is a natural aversion that individuals often have towards talking about dying or death in itself. There's been some very good work taken forward that members are aware of through the Good Life, Good Grief, Good Death programme. and we need to look at how we can build on that yet further in order to allow those discussions to take place. Now, one of the challenges, I think, is that professionals can be provided with the tools and the skills in which to have those discussions. But even with that, some professionals still find that difficult. It's something which I recognise that there's a personal element to it, that no matter how much we arm our staff with in terms of skills and knowledge, and there is a range of resources out there that can be provided through NES and others around palliative care, there is a personal element to this. And when you are working with families, that has to be recognised, and we have to also recognise that amongst the staff group who work with these groups of patients. But I think there is a need for us to make sure that we have a dialogue in this country which is healthy in how we look at issues around palliative care and the positive nature of palliative care, and also to discuss death and dying more openly. No single campaign is going to address that issue. I think all MSPs in their own leadership role within their own communities can help to contribute towards that. But I've got no doubt that if we can get ourselves into a more open discussion around some of these issues, it will help to support issues like the anticipatory care planning, making sure that those patients who may not have a cancer diagnosis but require palliative care get it more effectively at that earlier stage, when it should be recognised this is a life-limiting condition and we need to start to engage sooner rather than later. Again, Presiding Officer, can I thank those who contributed to this report. We will consider the recommendations in great detail. The National Advisory Group are already working on some of the recommendations as it stands, and will continue to look at how we can further improve the provision of palliative care in Scotland as a whole.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now that concludes Nanette Millen's Marie Curie Signpost to Palliative Care members' debate, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.